On this episode of the podcast, I have Jacob Vidrine back on as we wrap up our two-part episode on the Church of the Firstborn and the LeBarons. We continue our conversation on Alma Dayer LeBaron, the succession of his birthright, the ministry of Ross LeBaron and Fred Collier. We then dive into the unique teachings, doctrines, and theology of LeBaronism and wrap up this two-part episode with talking about the future of LeBaronism. That's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Look, it's no secret that our society has become much more crude and coarse. To become and raise men and women of virtue and character is a Herculean task. To help with this, I have recently wrote and published a book. Now, back in the 1700s, Washington had a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. It was a book with 110 rules that talked about how to conduct yourself like a civilized person in society, something that today's society is sorely lacking. What I did is I went back through the book and I reinterpreted his original sayings for the 21st century. So the book is laid out in a way in which you see Washington's original rule. Right below that is my explanation for the 21st century, and below that you'll find 2 or 3 examples of where to use this in the real world. Now, to go along with this, there's a workbook that helps parents teach these principles and practices to their kids. To find the book, go to MormonRenegade.com, go to the bottom of the page, search out the blog post, and order your copy today. I can bear personal testimony from personal experience that this is an invaluable tool to help you raise men and women of virtue and character.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.
All right, man. Welcome back.
It's good to be back.
All right. So real quick, just want to kind of recap what we did in episode 1 of this, or part 1 of this episode. So we talked a little bit about how you got into fundamentalism, all that stuff. And then we went ahead and we kind of started diving into the Council of 50 and that sort of stuff, because that weighs really heavily in LeBaron theology, if you will, and you know, line validation and priesthood line validation and those sorts of things. And then from there, we kind of got into who Benjamin F. Johnson was. And then we started talking about, you know, what the claims were, as far as, you know, Benjamin F. Johnson got his second anointings from Joseph Smith. He was Joseph Smith's adoptive son. Then we rolled into the claims on how the claims of being the rightful heir to Joseph Smith was, where Benjamin F. Johnson's third sister was proposed to by Joseph Smith. She was already engaged to somebody. She rejected him. And then from there, she kind of had a change of heart, and the whole family kind of considered I believe it's Alma Dayer LeBaron as the rightful heir of Joseph Smith. And then we started talking about Alma just a little bit, and that's where we kind of left off. So why don't you pick it up from there?
That's a pretty great summary of everything. You know, that was several hours of conversation condensed into, you know, those 2 hours of conversation condensed into 2 minutes. So I think that was pretty great. We definitely we left off talking about Alma Dayer LeBaron. He was given a special blessing when he was about 10 years old by Benjamin F. Johnson that he considered to be appointing him the birthright of Joseph Smith. What's interesting is I've gone to Nauvoo Temple birthright blessings that were given in the Nauvoo Temple, and the language of Johnson's blessing to Dayer in 1895 is very similar to what was given in the appointing the birthrights in the Nauvoo Temple, when different families were appointing family birthrights at that time. So Dayer's parents were encouraged to go to Mexico 10 years after the manifesto and enter into polygamy. They unfortunately weren't able to, but that seemed to be a big part of, you know, the culture at the time was, if you are a hardcore Mormon who's wanting to continue to live plural marriage and you want to kind of still try to be somewhat sustaining the manifesto, you're going to be trying to do your plural marriage in Mexico. So Dare's parents weren't able to live plural marriage. They attempted to, but it kind of fell through. But Dare was able to get to interact with some of those post-manifesto polygamists in Mexico, and he got to know John W. Taylor while he was down in Mexico. I believe that he actually painted one of John W. Taylor's homes in Mexico. And he said that Benjamin F. Johnson encouraged him that you should eventually move down to Mexico so that you can keep alive these higher principles of the gospel, because the United States has been so strongly against these principles. So you did great job recapping the LeBaron family history. The real claims of the family are that Dare's grandfather on his mother's side, Benjamin F. Johnson, was sealed to Joseph Smith as a son. That Dare's grandmother on his father's side, Esther Johnson LeBaron, was sealed to Joseph Smith as a wife, that she was kind of intended to be Joseph Smith's wife in eternity. She rejected him in Nauvoo, but at some later time, the LeBaron family believes that she was later sealed to Joseph as a plural wife. So
can I stop you right there? Because I think this is kind of important that we cover this, because I want to make sure that we're getting all the facts here. It says the family considered that she had at some point been sealed to him. Do we have any of those records anywhere?
We don't have those records, and we don't have the records of Johnson being sealed to Joseph Smith as an adopted son. But I do think that a lot of these sealing records that were done in early Utah are still, like, I feel like people haven't really scratched the surface of, say, the St. George Temple sealing records that have, we have all the Nauvoo Temple records. They've been published in a volume called the Nauvoo Endowment Companies, a 600-page book that details every single ordinance that was done in the Nauvoo Temple. But we don't really have those for Utah, with St. George Temple Endowment House. We've had pieces that have been made available, but not a whole lot. But one thing that I do think is very significant is that we do have a record of Esther Johnson LeBaron standing in the place of her sisters as proxies, having these sisters that had died also be sealed to Joseph Smith. We have the record of her standing as proxy with Joseph F. Smith, standing as proxy for Joseph Smith. So she was acting basically as a proxy wife for Joseph Smith, if that makes sense, having additional family members sealed as wives to Joseph Smith.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Because those records, they're to go back to what you were saying, a lot of those records are either still locked up in church vault somewhere, or maybe were even purged at some point. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's how I feel about it. One interesting story is Dare said that when he was about 24 years old, a close neighbor who was a close friend of Benjamin F. Johnson, Charles Sellers, gave him a box of Benjamin F. Johnson's special papers that had all these very important Nauvoo-related documents, a letter by Joseph Smith to Benjamin F. Johnson, the letter Johnson wrote to the first presidency in 1903, the Gibbs letter, as it's called. And he had all these papers, and we have multiple sources about him getting Johnson's like special papers. But Dare almost lost them on one occasion. He said that they were in a suitcase. They were traveling or something, and he had them in a suitcase, and he left it on the bus. And his brother recalled the police kind of bringing this, basically saying, this suitcase belongs to your brother. He left it on this bus, and it's important papers. And so Dare apparently, after having that experience, he turned this collection of papers from Benjamin F. Johnson over to the church archives for safekeeping. And unfortunately, the church archives safekeeping isn't as safe as you would like it to be. Those papers have never been found. The only paper we still have from that collection is the Gibbs letter. We still have, it's because Dare had made copies of the Gibbs letter, and it had been preserved down the family. And then also the original the original of that has been cataloged in the archives, but the rest of it has, hasn't been found. And so you have the same issue with like the 1886 revelation, supposedly being, that we know that it was donated in the church archives, but we don't know where exactly the original, handwritten copy in John Taylor's handwriting ever ended up. And, there's different things where, the church isn't always forthright when it comes to documents, right? So Dare, he spent a lot of his time growing up close to Benjamin F. Johnson and getting instruction by Benjamin F. Johnson. He said that when he was about 18 years of age, that Benjamin F. Johnson conferred upon him the authority that he held. And, the family has characterized that as a scepter, priesthood scepter or priesthood mantle. Dare would often call it the keys. He received the keys of the kingdom that Johnson held. The key, and then later on, shortly before Johnson's death, Johnson told him that when I die, my mantle will fall upon you as the mantle of Elijah fell on Elisha. So that was very important to Dare's priesthood claims, is this experience getting close with Benjamin F. Johnson and receiving some priesthood authority from him shortly before Johnson's death.
Real quick, I got a question for you. So, because there was a prophecy made by Joseph Smith that his children would continue to be the kind of head up the church, right? Why didn't Johnson make a bigger push if he was the rightful heir, right? Because he was the first adopted son of Joseph Smith, right?
The LeBaron family has the tradition that they've had several people that they say told them that there were records that show he was sealed as a firstborn son to Smith. I'm not sure if that is. I haven't, as I said, we don't have those records. I think what's very clear is this idea that Johnson had been sealed as a son to Joseph Smith. I'm not sure if Johnson was the firstborn son. And part of the way I look at this is that the family kind of looked at Dare's claims with wonder, and they probably were wondering how exactly Dare was in how Johnson was in a position to appoint their father to a special priesthood office or some sort of presiding priesthood authority of some sort. So the question, the question comes up in their minds, how did Johnson have the authority to do this? Did Johnson himself secretly have some sort of special status? But I do think that when I've studied the historical sources on the LeBaron story, it just seems to be that Johnson was one of the members of the Council of 50 who had received, all the priesthood keys through, the ordinances, and that he had been given a special commission by Joseph Smith that if he was led to pass things on to others, he wouldn't be led wrong in doing that. So, for example, one person recalled that Dare said that he claims his grandfather was the last one ordained to the keys of the kingdom and by Joseph Smith, and that his grandfather conferred that upon him.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time following this, and I just want to get to the bottom of this, because I think when you start talking about birthright claims, this gets super important. So if Benjamin F. Johnson is Joseph Smith's first adoptive son, his other sons don't come to Utah, right? They come to Utah. One figures out, oh crap, my dad really was a polygamist. He goes kind of crazy. Because he finds that out, because he figures out his mom, Emma Hale Smith, had lied to him. That would naturally put Benjamin F. Johnson in line to be the guy that heads up the church, not Brigham Young, not John Taylor. Why doesn't Johnson make the claim during that time? Hey, this is my birthright now. I am the first adoptive son of Joseph Smith. There doesn't seem to be a contention to that until Alma Dayer LeBaron comes along, right?
Yeah, and I don't, like I said, I feel like the family might have, came up with the idea of him being the firstborn, sealed as a firstborn son. I'm not quite sure that's historical. I do think that the early traditions that Johnson, like many others, had been adopted to Joseph Smith as sons. And the original family claim that I see is that Johnson was, quote, the last living member of the original Council of Friends to whom the prophet Joseph Smith gave priesthood authority and placed at the head of the kingdom of God. So Johnson wasn't claiming to preside over Brigham Young. He wasn't claiming to be secretly the one presiding over everyone. He just claimed to be one of those guys who had received full authority, and who was he was the last living person who had been part of the original Council of 50. And so that all ties into this claim that, this belief that Johnson believed that he had the authority to appoint or pass on special authority to his grandson.
Right. And priesthood keys and authority, I don't really have an issue with. It's this idea of a birthright, right? And I'm trying to figure out how much legitimacy is there. And so I just want to make it as clear as I can. I'm not trying to push back, and I'm not trying to dispute you here. You're a great historian, and I want to defer to you on that. But I kind of want to get to the bottom of it. So if Johnson doesn't press and say, hey, I'm the guy that has all the keys, and I'm the one that is supposed to have this birthright to lead up the church, why does Alma Dayer LeBaron make that claim when Benjamin F. Johnson doesn't, when Johnson is closer to the fount, right? To the headwaters, so to speak?
So I think Johnson was claiming some sort of unique presiding status as one of the last living members of the Council of 50. That's kind of how I see that there may have been some sort of claim. And that's not until after, say, Brigham Young, John Taylor, all of those original guys have passed away. Then Johnson, I think, is looking at things and seeing the trajectory of where the church is going. And in the Gibbs letter, he kind of he mentions very briefly that the church was kind of changing its doctrines. He said that, the doctrine of exaltation being this family kingdom of having wives, children, and friends sealed to you, and that, the parable of the talents representing, multiplying your talents. And Joseph applied that to polygamy, right? And he said that those items of doctrine were now being differently construed. So Johnson was seeing that the church was changing things, and that he knew that the Council of 50 had been it really became defunct after after Joseph Smith's death. And what's interesting is in the Gibbs letter, he actually briefly alludes to having done something to perpetuate that would eventually perpetuate the kingdom of God on the earth. It's a very good letter. I think anyone who's interested in church history should check it out. He said, the kingdom of God as it would become organized on the earth, though all nations learning war no more, and all adopting the God-given Constitution of the United States as a palladium of liberty and equal rights. But this itself would require a long chapter, which must wait until the fulfillment of a prediction by the prophet relating to a testimony that I should bear after I had become hoary with age, of things which he that day taught his circle of friends then around him, of whom I am the only one living. So here I will leave this subject for your further interrogation and proceed to give you, so far as I remember, the prophet Joseph Smith's last charge. So he kind of is alluding there, well, I've done something to secretly perpetuate the kingdom of God. I will leave this subject for your further interrogations. And now I'm going to move over to talking about the last charge. So that, is just kind of an interesting statement that seems to, in my mind, validate this idea that Johnson had done something secret and significant to perpetuate the kingdom, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that covers it. So it's less about the birthright and more about being the last one to have the keys and kind of given to him through the Council of 50. Is that right?
Yeah, and by having the keys, he has the authority, if he were so led by revelation and the Holy Spirit, to appoint the birthright. And we kind of see that in Heber C. Kimball was trying to raise up a son to Joseph Smith with Sarah Ann Whitney, repeatedly trying to have a son named David. Unfortunately, he had one son named David who died. They had another son named David who died. They had a third son, but that son didn't ever live to come forward to lead the kingdom. So you have these ideas, it's not in a vacuum. This is something that there were other people who were close to Joseph Smith entertaining these kinds of ideas. So
Perfect. I think that answers it. And again, I wasn't trying to to be argumentative. I was just trying to understand there.
But what is kind of really unique about Dayr's claim is he has this claim, but he's generally very private about it. He's saying that it's not going to be for a long time that this work is going to start. He's ordained by Johnson about 1903 to carry on the priesthood that Johnson held, but then he's told that it's not. He believes it's not until about 1950 is when the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled and the times of Israel is ushered in, that's when his priesthood work would really start. And so that's really unique. And he's generally pretty secretive about his, and protective about his priesthood claim. But there are some good kind of hostile witnesses, I would say, people who aren't believers in his claim, but are who are either family or a friend from going way back, who confirmed that these claims go back very early. Dayr's brother Conway, who was a mainstream member of the church his whole life, remember that there was a special blessing that Dayr was given by Benjamin F. Johnson, that to preside over his family, and that blessing has been, quote, a very sore spot for the Benjamin F. Johnson family.
Gotcha.
And similarly, in 1910, Margarita Bautista, who would become involved with Mormon fundamentalism in a very big way, he was friends with Dayr, and he said that he had discussed Dayr's claims as early as 1910 in Mesa, Arizona. So they were, so these weren't things that were coming decades later or developed over time. These were things that had been around for quite a while. So one thing that's interesting is, Dayr believed from Benjamin F. Johnson that he should try to establish his life and his family in Mexico. That was a big part of Dayr's beliefs. And I think that kind of is an outgrowth of what was going on with the plural marriage getting persecuted in the 1880s, and then the post-manifesto polygamy. But even as early as Brigham Young, when Brigham Young was still alive, I believe in the 1860s, he wrote a letter where he said he hoped that the settlements of the saints in the Rocky Mountains would actually extend up into Canada, extend down south into Mexico, and all the way down into Central America. So there was this idea of the settlements of the saints kind of going southward. And about the 1890s, there starts to be a prophecy of Joseph Smith that's being recalled by different individuals like Mosiah Hancock, where they're recalling that there might be another exodus where the saints from the Rocky Mountains would have to go south before returning to Jackson County. So there were these kinds of ideas that were floating around Mormonism at the time, and Dayr said that Johnson had really pushed the importance of these kinds of ideas to him. So Dayr, in 1911, married a young woman named Maud McDonald. Maud said she was actually dating a different young man who, and she turned him down because he said he hoped to God that plural marriage wouldn't be restored to the church in his lifetime. And the family tradition is that man was future Mormon president Spencer W. Kimball. So Spencer W. Kimball had a interesting fundamentalist connection in two different ways. He had been courting Maud, who would end up becoming the LeBaron family matriarch. And he also had a connection that the W in Spencer W. Kimball stands for Woolley. He was related to the Woolleys. So he had a fundamentalist connection on two different sides. And what's interesting is when historian Fred Collier started getting into fundamentalism and learning about fundamentalist claims, he went to Spencer W. Kimball and asked him about the 1886 revelation. And Spencer W. Kimball told him it's a true revelation, but the Woolleys had no right to publish it. So he confirmed the legitimacy of the 1886 revelation to him.
That's problematic.
Yeah. Once that's something. What's funny is there was a conversation between a church scholar and Apostle Marky Peterson once about Adam God. And the scholar was saying, we need to just admit that Brigham Young taught Adam God, but we should just say it was just his own opinion. And Marky Peterson said, oh, no, we can't do that. We would just send thousands of people over to the fundamentalists. So, the church, I think has to play a very fine line between telling the truth about the history, and trying not to send people over to the fundamentalists, because if people get too much history, they'll see that the history heavily favors fundamentalism.
Funny
So
how painting
Maud,
yourself into a corner with the facts does that to you, huh?
yeah. So Maud was also like Dare, was growing up during the post manifesto time period, and she said in 1909, when she's attending I think a church school at the time, she was taught by both B.H. Roberts and John Henry Evans about the importance of plural marriage as a higher law, and that all the students in the church education, still as late as 1909, were being taught that plural marriage was a higher law. And so she was firmly convinced that it was a true doctrine. And what she said, what's interesting is she would later learned from Nathan Clark that John Henry Evans was a secret post manifesto plural polygamist, that he had been married secretly to two of Nathan Clark's nieces. So he's one of the head guys over the church education in the early 1900s, and wrote a pretty famous biography of Joseph Smith. And he was secretly involved with post manifesto polygamy. Getting into Nathan Clark. So Nathan Clark is, since I mentioned his name, he's a very interesting guy, and he kind of is close friends with the LeBarons. And so his name, when you study LeBaron history, comes up quite a bit. Nathan Clark was ordained at the same time Joseph W. Musser was in the Joseph F. Smith's presidency to perpetuate plural marriage, according to both Price Johnson and Rulon Allred. So Price Johnson's getting it from Nathan Clark, Rulon Allred's getting it from Musser. And Price Johnson said it was Joseph F. Smith and John W. Woolley who were the ones who laid their hands on Joseph Musser and Nathan Clark's head and ordained them to perpetuate plural marriage. So, and Nathan Clark comes up even earlier during the trials of Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor, as being somebody who's the apostles who are trying to stamp out plural marriage are like, we don't really like this guy. He's an unsafe guy, and you shouldn't be keeping company with him, because they knew that he was involved with the post manifesto polygamy. So Darren and Maud moved down to Mexico shortly after getting married. And it's in Mexico, I believe it's in the year 1911, that Nathan Clark actually comes down to Mexico with a message from Joseph F. Smith, that he said he was given instructions to find Benjamin F. Johnson's heir and to bring him a copy of the marriage sealing ceremony with instructions to help keep plural marriage alive. And so there's sons tell this story. This is what one of the sons said. He said, he told us that years and years before Nathan Clark came to visit him in Mexico, having been sent by President Joseph F. Smith, he took my father a copy of the priesthood marriage sealing ceremony and told him that President Smith was calling upon him to help keep plural marriage alive. He said to my father, Dare, you have plenty of authority to perform these sealings in the marriage covenant, and we would like you to help keep this principle moving forward. And Dare's wife, Maud, actually says she was standing on and they're present when this conversation happened. She said, I was standing on the ditch bank in Colonial Juarez when Nathan Clark brought a copy of the temple marriage ceremony and handed it to Dare, saying Joseph F. Smith sent it to him, asking him to help keep plural marriage alive in the earth as long as he lived, but not to perform any sealings without the Spirit. So shortly after that, in the next year or two, there was the Mexican Revolution. So lots of the saints who were living in the colonies in Mexico had to go back to the United States. And Dare and Maud were with them, and Dare really regretted that, and he was unsettled about having to live in the United States again. And he actually said he had a 100-year vision that was showing him that things in Mexico would be getting better within the next 100 years, and that things in the United States would actually be deteriorating over the next 100 years. And so that vision and experience kind of led him to really think that he needed to eventually get his family back into Mexico. So after leaving Mexico and coming back to the United States, they were living in Salt Lake City for a while, and they actually got to stay briefly with John W. Taylor in his home. Maud recalled that the Taylors, very fascinatingly, had temple symbols incorporated throughout the artwork, the decoration of their home, and they're just absolutely beautiful gardens around their properties. And while staying there, John W. Taylor told Dare about the context of the 1886 revelation, and told and arranged to help him get a copy of the 4 hidden revelations so that he would have those, early fundamentalists kind of treated the 4 hidden revelations as actually pretty sacred, interestingly enough. Like there's one story I recall of a fundamentalist who's like, I've got something sacred to tell you about. And the other guy's like, well, what is it? I can't really tell you until we go somewhere, in a more private place to discuss sacred matters. And the fundamentalists kind of took him up into a mountain to show him the 4 hidden revelations. That's kind of how sacred and significant they treated those revelations at that time. The 1880 revelation, the 1882 revelation, the 1886 revelation, 1889 revelation, all about the necessity of the church continuing plural marriage and warning about, not giving into concessions, because this is a celestial law. So in the early 1920s, Dayer began to have questions about plural marriage, likely due to the LDS church's increasing hardline position against it under Heber J. Grant. Under Joseph F. Smith, the church was still very, friendly to it. And Joseph F. Smith was appointing tons of different people to be continuing plural marriage. According to one guy, there were patriarchs set apart in every stake of the church to see to it that plural marriage would continue.
Not only that, they actually went out of their way to set up special stakes almost, right? Like if I remember correctly from a previous conversation, the Yale ward and Yale stake were kind of a safe haven, if you will, for a lot of these gentlemen. And yeah, the patriarchs were instructed, and it's fascinating to see at this time of church history just how much disconnect is happening, right? Because you have Joseph F. Smith, who is keeping that alive. Like when he was famous for, people coming to him saying, we want to enter into this practice. And what would happen is that he'd say, well, if you can find someone with the authority, God bless you. And then there'd be a mysterious knock on the door and like, hey, you got an appointment at 7:00 down at the temple. You got to get to there. So in just a little while, one more president down the road, it's a completely different ballgame.
Yep. So Dayer was having kind of troubles in his mind about what was going on with plural marriage. And so he prayed for his grandfather, Benjamin F. Johnson, to give him further light and instruction regarding this and the course that he should take. And he said that one night, and this is sometime in the early 1920s, I believe it's about the time he's considering entering into plural marriage personally, he was given this vision of Benjamin F. Johnson. He said, so this is the account that one of his sons gives. He says, during this period, father's mind was filled with turmoil. What was he to do? Could a man not live plural marriage and still obtain a crown in the celestial worlds? The question weighed mightily upon him. Father had again petitioned the Lord to know what was required. Sleep came and he rested soundly. Suddenly, a firm hand gripped him by the shoulder and the familiar voice saying, Dayer, Dayer, my son, wake up. As he sat up in bed, he realized it was his grandfather's voice. Before his eyes, father beheld a vision which extended beyond the wall of the room. There, seated comfortably on a beautiful throne, was his grandfather, Benjamin F. Johnson, clothed in the white robes of the priesthood. In his right hand, he had a scepter of gold, which rested at his feet and extended above his head. A crown with 7 shining stars was upon his head. The beauty of it all exceeded anything father had ever seen. He understood that the scepter represented his priesthood authority his grandfather had held during his life. The jewels in his crown represented his 7 wives. As father gazed upon this glorious vision, he heard a penetrating voice out of the heavens, the voice of God. It said, this shall be your destiny also if you abide my law. Grandfather Johnson instructed father concerning the law and order of the priesthood and told him what his duties were. No longer was there any doubt in his mind. The course of his life became unalterably fixed. He did not turn back. Whatever he be called to face, he felt ready. He accepted the law of plural marriage, and he now knew for himself. And this experience became very significant to Dayer, and he would share it with other family members who would question him on the rightfulness of plural marriage continuing. He would share this experience he had with them. So what's interesting is around this time, Matthias Cowley, this is the early 1920s, Matthias Cowley is giving him some subtle encouragement to do it also. And after Dayer married his plural wife, his dad, Benjamin F. LeBaron, was kind of concerned about it because, the church leaders were turned against it. But then he said that Matthias Cowley and his dad visited and had a conversation, and his dad dropped all resistance to him being involved with plural marriage. And you can see the evidence of this is that his dad, shortly after he marries his plural wife, gives him a patriarchal blessing and basically says, you and your companions will receive a fullness of blessings in the temple of God. So it's kind of blessing him and his companions, showing that he recognized, that he was legitimate in entering into his plural marriage. So in Laverkin, Utah, Dare met and married his plural wife, Oni Jones. She said that her mother appeared to her and counseled her to marry Dare. So that experience really strengthened her to enter into plural marriage. They were married by Joseph W. Musser on December 7th, 1923, in the same room where the 1886 revelation was received. And so Alma Dayer and his wife Maud were excommunicated from the church on February 17th, 1924 for, quote, violative conduct, which, was in short for entering into plural marriage. What's funny is one thing I noticed in part of the family history is that they threatened to excommunicate Oni Jones for it as well. And they said, we're going to have a trial and you're invited to come to the trial. And she says, you can cut me off for all you want, but I'm not attending your damn trial. She kind of gave it to them, and they said, well, okay, fine. We weren't going to, because she said she wouldn't attend the trial. They just, kind of dropped the matter with her. And I don't believe she was excommunicated as far as I am aware. So the family moved out. So the family moved down to Mexico and established their lives there. They were initially on pretty friendly terms with the local LDS church members down there because there were so many polygamists in the colonies that were left over from those post-manifesto days from 1900 to even after 1904. For a couple of years they were still doing it on the sly, but apparently there were some who were like, he's in violation of the law. They were excommunicated for it. And so eventually those wanting to ostracize the family won out. And that social ostracism, living in a foreign country and the people who share your culture and share your language and heritage are not really wanting to be associated with you. That was very difficult on the family, and especially the children living down in Mexico. But they did make a few friends down there. One fun story is that there was another individual. They said we called him the best scriptorian in the stake. His name was Tom Jones, and he was sent to kind of talk with Dare about Dare's beliefs and try to, quote, convince him to repent of his ways. And Dare kind of shares with him the 4 hidden revelations. And Tom Jones, kind of comparing the 1890 manifesto to whom it may concern versus these 4 revelations that say, thus saith the Lord. He was converted to plural marriage, and he ended up entering into polygamy as well, and was another kind of independent polygamist down there in the Mexican colonies. And so the Joneses and the LeBarons were good friends during that time period. Dare tried to convince other fundamentalists to move down to Mexico. When he was doing work up in the United States, he was on good friendly terms with a lot of other fundamentalists, and he tried to convince them to come down. But most of them, ended up, I think living plural marriage is hard enough. Trying to live plural marriage in a completely different foreign country without any real community support, I think that is even way more difficult. So Dare was friends with other fundamentalists. We mentioned Nathan Clark before. Nathan Clark would be someone who was ordained by Joseph F. Smith to keep plural marriage alive, and he never really joined any group. He just kind of he was more of an independent sealer. Dare was friends with Francis Darter. Darter wrote that he and Dare were close friends for many years. Carl Jentz, I listened to an interview that was done with him in the 1980s, and Carl kind of talked about how he invited Dare to come stay with him when they was up in the United States, and he said Dare was trying to talk him into how great Mexico would be. He said there's lots of land down there, there's servants, it's cheap, there's a lot going to waste down there, and he said he made it sound really good. He said he made it sound really good, and I was really close to doing it. but he said that he kind of felt he had a revelation telling him to stick in the United States and to not really follow after any other authority claim. So what's another interesting story, and this is from I believe either the late 1930s or the early 1940s, is one of Dayer's younger sons, Alma Dayer LeBaron Jr., recalled an experience with John Y. Barlow. So a lot of the LeBaron boys, when they would come up to the United States, they got to be associated with the other fundamentalists, and they were on very friendly terms with the other fundamentalists. And so Alma Dayer LeBaron Jr. kind of talked about this experience with John Y. Barlow. He said, I went to John Y. Barlow. I got his home number, I think, out of a phone book or somewhere. And when I went to his home and knocked on the door and went in and introduced myself, he immediately drew down the curtains. I had a nice talk with John Y. Barlow. I told him that I would like him to give me special counsel of whether I should really go into the mission field or not. I believed in the fundamentalist doctrines at that time more than I did in the Mormon leaders. And he counseled me strongly to go into the mission field and do what good I could and be really careful. I asked him if he would confer the Melchizedek priest on me before I left because I didn't know for sure if I had it properly conferred, i.e. in the LDS church. And I wanted to make sure it was done properly. He said, well, I recommend you go get your father to confer the Melchizedek priesthood on you. And I said, well, I don't have too much confidence in my father. We had really had a lot of troubles in our family. I heard a lot of lies and slander against my father by my mother and by the Mormon leaders. And he told me, John Y. Barlow told me, in spite of the family problems and the lack of confidence in your father, he said, your father is a good, honorable man, and he deserves to have the first right to confer the priesthood on you. And he said, you go to your father and see if he'll confer the priesthood on you. And he said, and if he refuses to do it, come back to me and I'll do it. He said, but wait until you've been set apart for the mission field and all ready to leave. Then come and I'll confer the priesthood on you. A few days later, I met my father. He came to my hotel room. I told him that I would like him to confer the Melchizedek priesthood on me. And he just about cried. He immediately laid his hands on my head and conferred upon me the Melchizedek priesthood. So Dayer, in the 1930s, ordained, he had his oldest son's name was Benjamin, and he really was kind of expecting his oldest son to kind of be his successor to carry on his work. He said this work wouldn't start until 1950. He's going to be an old man by 1950. So he knew from the beginning that that this work would be carried on by his sons rather than being something that only he would do. So he, I believe it's 1932 or 1933, ordained his oldest son, Benjamin, to the keys that he held. But unfortunately, 2 years later, Ben went crazy. He started claiming to be the one mighty and strong, and he really had some mental breakdowns. One of the more famous stories is that wanting to prove that he was the one mighty and strong, he wanted to do push-ups in the middle of an intersection in Salt Lake City. He's planning on doing 200 push-ups and stopping traffic to do that, which is, a unique way to go about proving that sort of claim. But because of the mental demise of his oldest son, Dayer was very cautious about teaching his younger children about his beliefs and about his authority claims. And so that's why
Can I just say something right here about the one mighty and strong? Look, I have my beliefs on who it is. It's no one here today. Let's just get that out of the way right now. But when it comes to the one mighty and strong, I feel like if you have to tell me you're the one mighty and strong, you're probably not the one mighty and strong. I'm just going to say, I think that should be self-evident.
Yeah, it's kind of there's so many people who get caught up in titles and what title is someone claiming. And for me, I personally resonate a lot more with the revelation that Ross LeBaron, who was the second oldest son of Dayer, he said he received in 1950, basically saying, don't ask your dad to appoint you the birthright. He said, the honor is in the work, not the title. And he said, go ahead and ask your father for permission to carry on the work in your stead. And so I resonate a whole lot more with the honor is in the work, not what titles you're claiming. So after the 1944 raids on the fundamentalist community, there was a lot of concern about staying in the United States and whether they would get thrown back into prison. And Dayer actually came up to the United States and kind of recommended that, it might be a good idea for you guys to get established in Mexico, especially all of you people, the fundamentalist leaders with young family and with children. because, part of the agreement to get out of prison was that they wouldn't be teaching or continuing to be living plural marriage. But obviously, they weren't going to put their wives away, and they were going to continue to teach the fullness of the gospel. And so there was this encouragement to go down to Mexico. And John Y. Barlow got on it, and he encouraged Reuel and Allred and several other of the brethren to go down to Mexico. And Dare invited them initially to come, live and settle on his land. But it seems there was some sort of either miscommunication or dispute over authority that eventually led to them basically deciding to abandon this Mexico mission. According to the different members of the LeBaron family who told the story, they said that they were kind of saying, we won't stay down here unless you consecrate to John Y. and become part of John Y. Barlow's United Order. And Dare kind of was like, this is my land, I'm not going to they were kind of saying, we as the priesthood council have authority over you. And Dare kind of had an attitude that this is my land. And they basically said, well, if you don't deed this land over to us, then we're going to leave. And Dare kind of said, well, then you're going to unfortunately have to leave then. So it was a very brief stay. And that was kind of probably the first real conflict in authority between the, the LeBaron family and the Woolleyite factions. But I still don't think it was a very big issue, because even after that, Dare was still on pretty good terms with most of the other fundamentalist leaders. So as evidence of this, there's one of Dare's sons, Florin, recalled, I believe this was about the year 1949 or 1950, that Dare had him take him to see all these different fundamentalist leaders. And he's recalling this in an interview with several different individuals in 1994, and the person interviewing asked, do you want to talk about who you brought your father to right now? And Florin said, he took me to see Nathan Clark, Charles W. Kingston, Joseph Musser, and brother John Y. Barlow. And so it might have been earlier in the 1940s if Barlow was there. He said, those were the four men he wanted me to see. With Nathan Clark and Charles W. Kingston, he said, I especially want you to meet those men. So then the interviewer asked, who was he closest to, do you feel? And then he said, well, brother Musser. He says, do you think he might have told Musser about his calling, that he held the birthright? And Florin said, I think brother Musser and my father, they would sit there and they talked, and there was no friction whatsoever between those two men. I marveled at it now because of all the problems now that these two men got together, and there was perfect harmony. I think they perfectly understood what each other held. And so,
let me ask you this, because I think this is going to play a little bit too. And I think this will tell a lot about the relationships, right?
Okay.
You have Musser and LeBaron talking together. So is the assertion that Musser understood that that LeBaron held this birthright, and therefore did that make, in your estimation, does that mean that Musser understood that he had maybe I don't want to say lesser, but I don't know how else to put it, kind of a subservient position to LeBaron on this?
So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked me to clarify it. So I don't think that Dare thought Musser was above him. I don't think that Musser thought Dare was above him. I think they both there's a mutual respect for the different authority lines. I think, Musser respectively kind of believed that he, by the, late 1940s, was the guy who presided over the priesthood. But he also kind of looked at the LeBaron line with probably wonder, as a friend of mine put it, and probably respect that there were these other valid lines of authority that were passed on after the church. When the church abandoned plural marriage, that there were all these other lines that were going on. And so this is kind of evident in another statement by Alma Dayer LeBaron Jr. He said that he and his brothers had doubts about their father's claims on the authority question. So they actually, and this is again in the late 1940s, we wrote to Joseph W. Musser and asked him, does our father have authority to seal wives to us? Brother Musser wrote and answered, your father does have authority to seal wives to you. I saw the letter and Musser's signature with my own eyes. So again, I don't think that Musser believed that he was subservient to Dare, but I believe that he might have recognized that there could have been validity to Dare's lineage and claims that authority was being passed down that lineage as well. And as an impartial kind of witness to this, Bob Eby was a guy who was in Musser's School of the Prophets, and he later joined up with Ross LeBaron, but then he later he kind of became disaffected with Ross and kind of was his own kind of independent witness to fundamentalist history. And Bob Eby kind of told people that, yeah, Musser was on pretty decent friendly terms with the LeBarons from what he remembered in the, early 1950s, that, end of Musser's lifetime period. So this is kind of also evident in another one of the LeBaron family stories that was passed down, is that they said that Musser and Dare were visiting in March of 1950, and that Musser actually personally gave Dare a copy of the marriage sealing ceremony with his own signature on it. Basically kind of as a sign of mutual respect is kind of the way that I would characterize it. And I do think that Musser probably looked at the LeBaron claims with wonder, maybe a little bit of skepticism, but probably with a little bit of wonder as well, if that makes sense. So,
yeah, so it's not so much who's above who, it's okay, they have authority as well, right?
yeah,
Not a higher authority, not a lower authority, just authority as well. Is that a correct summarization there of that?
yeah, that's how I think that Musser probably looked at it. So Dare, during the end of his life, 1950, he's in his 60s at that time, and there's some concerns about appointing a successor. He tried to he tried to prepare his oldest son to be a successor, but his oldest son went crazy. Their second oldest son, Ross, was really the only other child of Dare that was really converted and really interested in his father's unique priesthood claims and beliefs. And Ross said that this kind of happened because, so he said he was studying in the 1930s. He was really associating with the Woolleyite Council and being on friendly terms with the Woolleyites. But he said that he tried to enter into plural marriage, and he actually got incarcerated with the other fundamentalists in the early 1940s over attempting to live plural marriage. He was incarcerated on, quote, conspiracy charges, conspiracy to try to live plural marriage. And he said that it was when he was in prison or in jail that he had a vision that kind of manifests to him that both the Woolley line and the LeBaron line had validity. This vision kind of confirmed to him his father's claims. They believed that the Woolleys were kind of operating under the claims of having Hiram's special keys and authority. And you can see that from John Woolley and Musser, both each. John Woolley, Lauren Woolley, and Musser kind of claimed that the patriarchal keys were passed down to the Woolleys and to their line. And Ross believed that this vision confirmed to him that his family was operating under Joseph's keys. So there was Hiram's keys doing their work, and Joseph's keys were doing their work. So in March of 1950, Ross is visiting with his father, and he asks his father for a patriarchal blessing, and his father gives him a blessing, and after the blessing ordains him to all the keys, rights, and authority of the patriarchal priesthood. And this was kind of, and might raise some people's eyebrows, like, what does that even mean? And Ross understood that this was basically his father conferring upon him the priesthood keys restored in the Kirtland Temple, basically outside of the ordinances. That was a big part of Ross's teachings, was that keys can really actually be conferred outside of the ordinances, and that keys are wherever they are placed. And you kind of see this going back to early Mormonism. There's some people who think that you can only receive the priesthood keys to do temple ordinances through receiving like the second anointing. But from my study of early church history, it seems that the brethren believed you could ordain someone to all the keys outside of the temple ordinances. And this is one example of this, or two examples of this, from Wilford Woodruff's journal. And on October 8th, 1851, when Heber C. Kimball's ordaining a man to be a traveling bishop, it says that he was ordained under the hands of Heber C. Kimball, John Smith, and George A. Smith, and Heber C. Kimball sealed upon his head all the keys of the priesthood. And so similarly, in October 27th of 1880, Wilford Woodruff wrote in his journal, when they're ordaining John Henry Smith to be an apostle, he gives the wording of the ordination. He says, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the authority of the holy priesthood and apostleship conferred upon us, we lay our hands on your head and we ordain you an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and as a member of the quorum of the 12 apostles, and we seal upon you all the power and authority to administer in all the ordinances of the house of God. And so this kind of idea that you can confer the keys to do the ordinances outside of the ordinances is something that I see evident in early Utah Mormonism, and is something that I see up into, I believe, the 1940s or 1950s, where presidents of the church at times would set people apart to delegate, to hold different temple keys, if that makes sense.
I think I see where you're going there. My issue would be this, is that two things. One is you don't get to baptize somebody else till you've been baptized yourself, right?
Well, I think that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery kind of showed that you can, so for example, they have the keys, and then Oliver baptized Joseph, and then Joseph baptizes Oliver, right? And that's kind of how you kind of see that in a number of circumstances. For example, when Joseph and Hiram, so when the second anointing is revealed in September 28th, 1843, normally Joseph would follow this pattern of having first conferred the ordinance on someone else, and then somebody else gives the ordinance back to them, is generally what Joseph Smith does. But in the case of the second anointing, it's kind of interesting in that we have the testimony that Joseph assigned Hiram Smith and William Marks to give him his second anointing, and him and Emma, so they are the first people to get it. And so by that context, Hiram and William Marks had the keys to perform Joseph's second anointing, even though they had not yet received their second anointings themselves. Hiram would be the second person, William Marks would be the fourth person, I believe, to receive the second anointing.
But those are one-off events when the restoration is getting going, right? Those aren't. There was a pattern after that, right? Once those things were established, whether it be baptism or second anointings, those are one-offs in the process of setting things up, because everything that flows after that is very orderly, right? Where
I think there's, yeah,
if that makes sense. I'm just trying to understand here. So those are one-off events at the beginning. We don't see that a whole bunch after that, do we? I mean, that doesn't seem to be the pattern. The other thing I would say to this is that I'll let you answer that one, and then I'll ask my follow-up question to that.
Okay. So I do think that the ideal way of things was obviously through the ordinances, but I do think that they recognized in early Utah that there was kind of a hesitancy to do higher temple ordinances outside of the temple. And you kind of see this with, them not doing any more, baptisms for the dead or second anointings until, the 1867. So there's kind of like a, there's a real delay. Brigham Young initially is kind of saying that we don't want to do any of these ordinances outside of the temple. And so the idea of conferring the keys outside of the ordinances is based kind of on an idea that, outside of the temple, that we can pass on the authority. And then when things are in a better space, when you're got a proper, situation to do ordinances, then you can go ahead and do ordinances, if that makes sense. And you kind of see this with early fundamentalists, where they were not originally doing temple ordinances for the most part. It's not until the late 1940s, early 1950s, they start having this concern that, we've gone decades without doing temple ordinances. But early on, like Musser is ordained to the priesthood of Elijah, after his second anointing. And it's kind of this being ordained to the priesthood of Elijah by the laying on of hands by Joseph F. Smith was kind of saying, I'm giving you full authority to do all the ordinances, that are necessary, as will become, as you will be directed. And I do think that part of this, I think part of this, can be supported through Joseph Smith's teachings when you look at his March 10th, 1844 speech, where he's talking about Elias, Elijah, Messiah. And he says the power of Elijah is to perform all the ordinances of the house of God and all the endowments of the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood. So Joseph was saying that the priesthood of Elijah comprehended, doing all the ordinances. And so I understand there are different schools of thought on this. I'm just explaining kind of the LeBaron perspective for how the keys have been passed down in the LeBaron belief system, if that makes sense.
No, that's perfect. That's great. That explains a lot. Appreciate that.
So Ross gets ordained to the keys. He's not yet appointed his father's successor. And he says that his father comes out again several months later in May of 1950, and he's really concerned that his father's not going to live a whole lot longer. He says, you need to appoint a successor, before you die. And, Daye's kind of attitude was, I can't appoint a successor until I get revelation from God appointing who the birthright is. Daye was really big that this needed to be appointed by revelation rather than a personal preference. And so Ross, when he said he got a revelation the next morning saying, your dad will not confer upon you the birthright, but if you ask him for the authority to go ahead and carry on the patriarchal work in his stead, he will give you that authorization. The honor is in the work, not the title. And so Ross went to his dad and had this discussion with him. His dad said, you are free to go ahead in the patriarchal work as the Lord inspires you. And your brother here is the witness that I'm giving you this authority. And so Ross starts kind of in 1950, starts kind of teaching about their family's priesthood claims. He's also teaching this idea that there is a order of priesthood that is above the church, that is to establish a new family order of the saints, that the saints should be preparing to get, to move up into this patriarchal order of the priesthood. So Daye on his deathbed, Daye actually dies less than a year later in February of 1951, and he's according to his brother, the reason Daye died quickly is he said that he was driving in his truck and it tipped over on him and it hurt his neck really bad, and he became very sick, and eventually paralysis set in. And 3 months before his death, he was completely helpless and couldn't move any part of his body or talk. And so Daye was kind of wanting to appoint his birthright successor on his deathbed. And on his deathbed, he's trying to, he might have had a little bit of conflict with Ross over, Daye was really big on living in Mexico, and Ross kind of established his life in Utah. And so I feel like that might have been a decent part of there being some sort of disagreement between Ross and Daye. And so Daye on his deathbed is trying to appoint one of his sons to the family birthright. And he's trying to appoint his younger son, Joel, the birthright. But according to a contemporary source at the time, it's according to his wife, Maud, she says that he really wanted to do it, but he couldn't without divine direction. So the Holy Ghost essentially wouldn't let him appoint the birthright. And he said that he wanted to send for Ross to come down to Mexico and qualify for it. But unfortunately, Ross said he was still under bond to not leave the state of Utah. And so he wasn't able to come down to Mexico. And so Daye kind of died without formally appointing Ross as his successor. And I would say as an analogy to this is that Brigham Young wasn't ever appointed Joseph Smith's successor while Joseph was alive. Brigham was one of the closest men to Joseph Smith. Brigham had been ordained to all the authority that Joseph held. He'd been a part of the temple ordinances. He received the full authority, all that one man could give to another man from Joseph Smith. And it's not until the transfiguration of Brigham Young experience on August 8th, 1844, that the saints were shown that the mantle was going to Brigham Young after Joseph's death. And so in a similar way, I think Ross wasn't formally appointed the birthright by Daye while Daye was alive, but that Ross was really the one in the best position to carry on Daye's work as, the older son basically the only son who has really understood his father's priesthood claims and was trying to carry on his father's teachings. I personally believe that the reason that God wouldn't let Dare appoint Joel was because Joel, as of that time, hadn't yet accepted his father's teachings or his father's priesthood claims. And so right after Dare died, Joel actually organized the family in Mexico as being a branch of what would be known as the All Red Group, which is something that Dare hadn't allowed to be done while he was alive. And so that showed Joel and many of the younger brothers were still very much in Woolyites in their priesthood beliefs as of that time. So Dare died on February 19th, 1951. After Dare's death, Ross is really the one who's trying to carry on his father's teachings, and he's began teaching about the patriarchal priesthood and how men were supposed to qualified to advance into this family order and hold priesthood authority to administer to their own families in a patriarchal organization. So Ross said, interestingly, two of the first men who he said accepted his claims and his teachings were Brigham Young III and Heber Chase Kimball, who a grandson of Brigham Young and a grandson of Heber C. Kimball, who both kind of had claims that they had the family birthrights of those families that had been passed down to them. And Ross actually said that Heber Chase Kimball was probably the first man that he personally ordained to the patriarchal priesthood. So I think that's a big part of Ross's teachings was he wasn't trying to magnify all the authority in himself, but he said, my job is to pass out the authority that I've been given to others and help them get established as patriarchs in their own rights. So after Dare died, Ross said that the same day that he got a letter from his brother telling him that his father had passed away, he got a revelation. He said a voice from heaven told him that the work of the patriarchal house of the prophet Joseph Smith is now upon your shoulders. He said that a few weeks after that, he had a revelation to go see Joseph W. Musser and have Musser confirm that he is the one who's received their family's birthright. And so Ross wrote about this in a pamphlet in 1962. He said, revelation given to Patriarch Ross W. LeBaron at the home of Heber Chase Kimball in Salt Lake City, April 3rd, 1951. My father had recently passed away, and I was concerned over what course to follow in connection with the patriarchal work he'd given me in the spring of 1950. And I received the following revelation. Thus saith the Lord, go unto my servant Joseph W. Musser and have your patriarchal keys, which you received from your father, confirmed. For he is the only man among the fundamentalists that has sufficient authority to do so, where he has received his second anointings and holds the fullness of the priesthood. To Rosslyn wrote that I called on the home of Brother Musser. One of his wives answered the phone, and I asked for an appointment to see him, but she informed me that he was not feeling well. I told her that I had a work to do and that I would like to see Brother Musser before I started, and that if it was of the Lord, he would see me. She told me to wait and she would ask him. When she returned to the phone, she told me that he wanted to see me and to come in at 2 that afternoon. One of his wives stayed in the room while we talked. As I entered the room, he spoke first, saying, you've had a revelation. Yes, I answered. I've come to honor you as Abraham honored Melchizedek. Brother Musser asked me to sit down as the twin bed next to where he was lying and held my hand during the conversation. And so he goes on, he kind of explains their family's story and their priesthood claims. And Musser says, that's a mighty high claim. And so then Ross replies, yes, the highest title of birth and the second order of priesthood. Brother Musser said in a firm voice that thrilled and penetrated my soul, I confirm this. I explained some of my views concerning patriarchal law, and the time had now come to start teaching these principles. He again confirmed my view. I felt to bless him under the patriarchal authority I held, and I promised him that he should have strength in this work. A few weeks later, I wrote him a letter instructing him to go forth in his old age, even as Adam, and bless and organize his house according to the patriarchal law. So there were some people, Ross kind of after this, there's some people who kind of felt that Musser was incapacitated by the early 1950s because he actually had a stroke even before John White Barlow died. And some people kind of said that, there was kind of this dual personality. And Ross kind of mentioned that too. He said that, but he seemed totally cognizant and totally clear in all my interactions with him. And so, when that story was related to somebody who was ordained to the priesthood line coming from Joseph Thompson, they kind of said that Joe Thompson said that same idea, that there were times where Musser, kind of didn't look all there, but there were other times where he was absolutely clear and cognizant when he's doing his work during the last couple of years of his life. So Ross, by the year 1955, believed he got some sort of revelation. He got a revelation confirming to him that this patriarchal order was to be called the Church of the Firstborn. That was to be a separate, distinct church from the Church of Jesus Christ. And, that the fundamentalists, instead of looking to fall back into the LDS Church, as so many fundamentalists were talking about around that time, Ross said you should instead hope to advance into the Church of the Firstborn level of the gospel. And so this was on January 6, 1955. He said, first speaker, Ross Wesley LeBaron, arose immediately and addressed us on the restitution of all things, such as the patriarchal rule, the Adamic dispensation, along with the Church of the Firstborn. He proceeded to explain the organization of the patriarchal priesthood in the latter days. And he goes on and says, we need not fall back into the church one day, but instead we can become part of the Church of the Firstborn. So when Ross's brothers, Joel and Florin, were visiting Utah in the later part of 1955, they actually initially came up to visit family, and they also visited the All Red group leaders at that time in August of 1955. But then they stayed with Ross a few weeks later in September, and Ross actually converted them to the legitimacy of their father's priesthood. And Ross recalled that Joel got really excited about this. He says, well, we should go ahead and organize the Church of the Firstborn if that's what it's going to be. And so they actually went and they formally organized on September 21st, 1955, the Church of the Firstborn. And what's interesting about these minutes is it shows that Ross's younger brothers, Joel and Florin, sustained him as receiving the priesthood keys and the work that had been passed down to their father from Ben Jeff Johnson. So the minutes record the calling of Ross W. LeBaron, received of his fathers, holding all the keys, rights, and authority of the patriarchal priesthood, was confirmed by patriarchs Joel and Florin LeBaron to preside as head patriarch in the Church of the Firstborn of the fullness of times, to hold all the patriarchal keys of this dispensation held by the prophet Joseph Smith and handed down to Patriarch Benjamin F. Johnson by the prophet and conferred upon the head of Patriarch Alma Dayer LeBaron, who conferred them on his sons. And so what's interesting is this meeting minutes show that Ross presided over it, and then Ross ordains both Joel and Florin to the priest, all the keys, rights, and authority of the patriarchal priesthood to be patriarchs in their own rights at this meeting. So that shows that really, that Ross was the one who was presiding over that first meeting. But shortly after that, Joel, I believe it was only a couple days later.
Well, let me ask you a question real quick. I want to explore this idea of the Church of the Firstborn here, because we read about it in the Doctrine and Covenants quite a bit.
Okay.
Why wasn't this ever brought about this way in Brigham's time, right? We can say, okay, maybe Joseph was martyred before he could fully institute it, but we assume that this was passed on as well to Brigham Young, right? Why doesn't this ever get brought forward before Ross?
So I think we talked a little bit last time about kind of all these fundamental Nauvoo priesthood ideas that Joseph Smith was instituting. And we also kind of talked about how after Joseph Smith's death, that the apostles didn't feel fully in a position to perpetuate all of these ideas. And, like we mentioned with the fullness of the priesthood, they actually left out a very important Brigham Young statement about it out of a sermon in the history of the church that they were compiling. And they also didn't mention the fullness of the priesthood for most of the early Utah time period from about 1848 to it was 1869 is when I was going through the Journal of Discourse. And that's when you finally have comments, 20 years later about the fullness of the priesthood. And so I think the Church of the Firstborn under Joseph Smith was intended to be kind of more of an inner church that members would eventually advance into. And when Joseph Smith was establishing it in Nauvoo, it was a secret organization. And the apostles definitely initially did keep it secret, but there were a few occasions where they did make statements about this. The most significant one being Heber C. Kimball's statement in Journal of Discourses, Volume 5, page 129 through 130, where this is on August 2nd, 1857, during the middle of the Utah War. And there's basically threats that when the troops get to Utah, they're going to cut off the head of the church. They're going to grab all the apostles and have them all executed for treason. And so it was in this context that Heber C. Kimball kind of lets the cat out of the bag and makes the only very explicit Church of the Firstborn statement that we have in the early Utah time period, where he says, "Let me explain what the Church of the Firstborn is. It is the first church that ever was raised up upon this earth. That is the firstborn church. That is what I mean. When God our Father organized that church, he organized it just as his Father organized the church on the earth where he dwelt. And that same order is organized here in the city of Great Salt Lake. And it is that order that Joseph Smith, the prophet of God, organized in the beginning in Kirtland, Ohio." So my opinion is that he says in Kirtland, Ohio, because that's where the keys were restored in the Kirtland Temple. So Brother Brigham Young, myself, and others were present when that was done. So they were all present in the Kirtland Temple when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery received those temple keys from Moses, Elias, and Elijah. When those officers received their endowments, they were together in one place. They were organized and received their endowments and blessings, and those keys were placed upon them, and that kingdom will stand forever. Now mark it, that kingdom will never be overthrown. Although they may kill, that is, if they can, Brother Brigham and me and Brother Daniel H. Wells, so that's the first presidency, and they may kill the apostles if they can, and so they may keep on from this time to all eternity, and they never can obliterate this work. I know it. They may kill and destroy and waste a great many limbs there upon this church, but let me tell you, they never can kill the tree nor destroy the root from whence we have sprang. For our Father and God is that root, and Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is the tree or vine, and we spring out of that vine. So this is probably the only very explicit statement about it in the early Utah period, if that makes sense. In the Nauvoo Temple, they mentioned that Heber C. Kimball made a comment saying that when we get fully organized, we have the celestial kingdom organized here. And so that's referencing kind of the Church of the Firstborn. And so fundamentalists early on, they knew about this statement, but they didn't really put it all together as being kind of like the temple ordinances and the temple doctrines and the temple priesthood is what is to establish the Church of the Firstborn. They kind of looked at it as in kind of vaguer terms, like some of them looked at it as a heavenly church, as most mainstream Latter-day Saints believe the Church of the Firstborn is, but some of them looked at it as it's all the saints that are living all the laws of God. And so really, I do think that Ross was kind of a pioneer in believing that actually this is going to be a very distinct new organization that you should hope to advance into rather than falling back into the Church of Jesus Christ. And similarly, Joseph Fielding Smith made many comments about the Church of the Firstborn in some of his writings, where he had some of these similar ideas about, that the Church of the Firstborn is the inner church of those who have received the highest ordinances of the temple, is kind of what Joseph Fielding Smith expresses in his writings. So Joel, less than a week after Ross and them organized the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times, Joel goes and says that he basically went up into the mountains to get a revelation, and he had Farmington Canyon was the location. He said he had no fewer than, I think, 17 different resurrected angels appear to him and appoint him the one mighty and strong. I kind of chuckle, but that was his serious claim that he made. And he basically, when Ross and Joel organized the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times, Joel and Ross kind of agreed that we'd work together with Ross presiding until the one mighty and strong kind of comes. Is kind of what they discussed when they initially organized. And so, very convenient, Joel just says, well, I am the one mighty and strong, and I am now the head. And so that led to a separation between Joel and Ross. And Joel kind of went down to Mexico, and the rest of the family kind of followed him. They kind of followed him based on the fact they said, Joel's never lied, so I don't know. I don't think that he would lie about this experience, is kind of what I see in a lot of the different family writings about Joel's claims. They initially reacted very, very skeptical when I've studied the Mexican LeBarons. I heard one source said that Maud's initial reaction was, "Oh no," was what she said. And she actually wrote a letter to Ross, kind of blaming Ross for getting Joel all excited about, priesthood claims and their families, priesthood lineage. And so Joel went down to Mexico and organized kind of the family in Mexico. He was really big on, my father was big on Mexico, so we're going to be big on the fact that the saints should gather down to Mexico. And that's actually, Joel actually, before he left Utah to go down, or it was either right before he left or right after he got down to Mexico, late 1955, he actually dictated a revelation to Reuel Allred saying, thus saith the Lord, tell your people to all gather down to Mexico. And Reuel Allred kind of responded very, you're not the one to be telling me to gather my people down to Mexico. So Reuel didn't accept the revelation that Joel gave him. So there are some significant differences between Joel LeBaron's theology and Ross LeBaron's theology on priesthood that I think would be important to cover to kind of allow people to understand the contrast. So Joel kind of taught that the highest priesthood office was a one-man, self-perpetuating office, and that this office had been passed down to him by, that he actually claimed that Ben Jeff Johnson did secretly hold the highest office in the priesthood, even above Brigham Young. And that's not something that Ross claimed in Ross's original teachings. So Joel believed that there's a self-perpetuating highest office, the first grand head, or the right of the firstborn, and that this was passed all the way down to him. And in contrast to that, Ross believed that the one-man office to preside over the highest order of priesthood kind of grew out of the higher order of the priesthood, that the right of the firstborn was just the person who presided, but lots of other people could hold this highest priesthood. So Joel's priesthood structure was kind of based off of Loren Woolley's teachings, where if you get a copy of, say, Lynn Bishop's writings, he talks about there being a political organization of the kingdom, a spiritual, and an economic, kind of three different circles. And Joel really adopted that kind of idea. But different from Woolley had the Council of Friends above it, and then the president of the priesthood above that. In contrast to that, Joel put the presiding patriarch and the right of the firstborn, the one-man office, as the two offices above that. So his ideas were heavily kind of influenced by Woolley, in my opinion, but he kind of mixes a little bit of their family's claims into it. So Ross taught that the right of the firstborn, which was one of the names for this highest office, was to stand in the place of Adam, kind of as Adam's birthright heir over the house of Israel on earth. Joel, in contrast, believed that the right of the firstborn was to stand in the place of Jesus Christ. So Joel believed that he was, by organizing the Church of the Firstborn in Mexico, he was reorganizing the Church of Christ. Joel believed the Church of the Firstborn was just another name for the Church of Jesus Christ. And so that's what he organized, was based off of kind of the priesthood structure with the 12 apostles, with a high council, with all these different quorums, while Ross believed that it was a distinct patriarchal organization. So there was a big difference there. What I would give points, one person who got to know Joel, and I believe was part of Joel's church, and later became a Ross LeBaronite, said that Joel kind of restored the checks and balances to the Church of Jesus Christ's priesthood structure that had kind of been lost in Utah Mormonism, where, over time, the power got gradually concentrated and more concentrated rather than having these divisions of equal authority. And this person said that one thing that he really appreciated about Joel's structure was there were all of these different checks and balances to authority. And when you study Brigham Young emphasized that in talking about the organization of the church and the beauty of it. And Brigham Young said that a bishop presides over everyone in his ward, regardless of how high of an office they held. If you are 70, if you are an apostle, you are still subject to the bishop of your ward. And Brigham Young said, even the bishop has a right to come to my house and to inquire into whether I'm, keeping the commandments, or I'm keeping, my family in order, and, all the temporal matters that a bishop should look after. And he said that, the stake president would kind of be in charge of the spiritual matters of a quorum. And so there's kind of this division and balance of authority that's really beautiful in what Joseph Smith divinely established with the organization of the church. So Joel, to get back to some of the differences between Joel and Ross's teachings, Joel believed that the patriarchal priesthood, so Joel kind of had to come up with a way to kind of downplay Ross's authority. So he taught that the patriarchal priesthood was just part of the Aaronic priesthood rather than being kind of part of the Melchizedek priesthood. And so that was a pretty unique thing that he taught. And, some people have commented that they've never really took Joel's priesthood teachings very seriously because of him saying that. Because Joseph Smith made many statements about the patriarchal priesthood being above the Aaronic priesthood. So, in contrast, Ross taught that the patriarchal priesthood was a higher order of priesthood restored in the Kirtland Temple that was above the church. So, one thing that's interesting is that Joel did get John Birthright, who was one of the council members under Joseph Musser's new council, to come down to Mexico and to be an apostle in his organization. So Joel's claims, did have some weight to some individuals. But, like I said, most of the, Reuel and Allred and the rest of the council who got that revelation from Joel didn't accept it. So Joel basically organized his own church from scratch, and they published Priesthood Expounded in 1956, which really kind of outlines their priesthood teachings. And Ross LeBaron kind of was the author of it. And Joel was initially trying to invite Margarita Bautista to come join and be part of their organization, but Bautista didn't. He thought they were off base. And so when Bautista died, Joel believed that Bautista held the patriarchal office of Hiram, the keys of the office of presiding patriarch, which had been passed down the Woolley line. But Bautista died without really appointing someone. And so Joel appointed Ross I believe it was 1962, to be the presiding patriarch of their organization, to be kind of under him as the second grand head. But very quickly, to get kind of into the Ross LeBaron mess that kind of happened down there in Mexico, Ross eventually came to realize from Joseph Smith's teachings that the presiding patriarch wasn't just an office in the Aaronic priesthood. It actually was a special, significant office in the Melchizedek priesthood. And you can see that when Joseph Smith said that the patriarchal office is the highest office in the church. And Father Smith conferred that on Hiram on his deathbed. And Joseph Smith in the Nauvoo Temple Revelation, D&C 124, lists the office of presiding patriarch first in all the offices of the church government. And so Ross got it in his head, realizing that he felt the patriarchal priesthood actually should preside. And so the office of presiding patriarch should preside. And so there was kind of a conflict in authority between Ross and Joel, starting about 1970 is when it fully came out. And there was a division between Ross and Joel over the office of presiding patriarch. So a couple other aspects of Joel's teachings. Joel, one thing that was unique was that he interpreted the D&C, I think it's 131, where it mentions there's 3 degrees in the celestial kingdom. Joel instead interpreted that as saying, it says 3 degrees of glory in the celestial glory. And Joel instead says that there aren't actually sub-degrees. Joel believed that that's just referencing the 3 degrees of glory, the celestial, terrestrial, and telestial. So that's just kind of an interesting note. That was his first interesting kind of unique teaching he had. Joel also was really big on reestablishing the civil law of God as found in the Old Testament. And so when you look at the LeBarons in Mexico, that's something they were really big on, is restoring this idea of civil law. And they thought that this was what, we needed to do to establish theocracy, is kind of what they emphasized. But you got to be really careful with some of those ideas with the Old Testament and restoring civil law, because there's stuff in the Old Testament can be used to say that false prophets should be put to death. And I believe that was part of what Ross used as his justification to begin killing people, was that part of it was that he felt that a false prophet could be put to death, and that he considered Joel to be a false prophet based off of their conflict in their authority. And so in 1972, Ross actually did succeed in having his followers kill Joel. And then he this kind of start, which was unfortunately just the start of a very bloody rampage where Ervil kind of was going around demanding tithing from everyone in Mormonism, not just not just in his own little circle of followers. He was thinking that everyone in Mormonism needed to tithe to him, as he believed he was the head of all civil and priesthood authority on earth. And he was was having his followers send out letters basically demanding people submit to him and pay tithing to him. And if they didn't, then they would get a warning that, if you're not going to do this, you're risk that you are in rebellion to Ervil's authority, and you risk being put to death. And so Ervil, unfortunately started going on and his followers started going on the spree of murders under the guise of, civil law and the fact that we can put to death people who are in rebellion to our civil law. And it's very, very awful, very ugly, very evil. And it brings to mind that Dayer LeBaron actually had a vision that Satan would make war on his family and attempt to destroy his family. And this is kind of mentioned in a history back in the early 1960s. So it shows that this vision was something that the family knew about long before Ervil started going down the path that he went on. And it seems to me that evil Ervil became the main instrument in the hands to try to do this. And unfortunately, it wasn't limited just to the LeBaron family, but he felt that any other competing authority in Mormonism was a target to be liable to be put to death. And so after Joel and Ervil separated, Joel appointed his other brother Verlin to be the presiding patriarch in Ervil's stead. And so after Joel was killed in 1972, Verlin, as the only remaining presiding office over the Mexico LeBarons, he had a target out on his head now to be killed. Ervil wanted to have Verlin put to death too. And Verlin obviously went into hiding, and he lived the next 9 years of his life basically on the run to try to avoid being killed by Ervil. And Ervil kind of was like, he and his followers were trying to figure out a plan to kill Verlin. And the way that they came up with it is, one of the worst tragedies in fundamentalist history, in my opinion, is that Ervil decided that they should kill Rulon Allred as a way to get to Verlin, because Verlin was close with Rulon at a time. And Verlin had, I believe he actually had one or two of his wives sealed to him by Rulon Allred. And so they were on friendly terms, Verlin and Rulon. And so Ervil and his followers concocted the idea to have.
Can't get enough of the Mormon Renegade podcast? Well, good news. We're on Patreon, and there's 3 packages that you can choose from. The first one, the Slightly Rowdy package, allows you to hear the podcast without all those pesky commercials getting in the way. For those who want a slightly more in-depth experience, there's the Stirring It Up package, where you can hear ad-free audio, ad-free video, and transcripts. Finally, for those who want to go full Renegade, that package is available too, where you can get everything in the previous 2 packages, plus an extra show where myself and Ben Winfield break down the news of the day from a very Mormon point of view. You will also get exclusive access to Renegade Chat, and on there you'll be able to talk to others about the show or whatever topics are on your mind. Go to Patreon today and get your exclusive content.
Rulon killed so that they could get to Verlin, and then they could kill Verlin at Rulon Allred's funeral. And so Ervil had 2 of his wives go and shoot Rulon Allred in his doctor's office, and it's a very awful, disgusting crime that occurred. And they hoped that at Rulon Allred's funeral that they would be able to kill Verlin, but there was so much security, so much police presence there that it basically scared off Ervil's people to not try to do it. And Verlin didn't realize that until later on, that the whole purpose of killing Rulon was to try to kill Verlin also.
What's Ross's take on all this, right? As Ervil goes off the deep end and begins this campaign of bloodshed that really is unparalleled in fundamentalism. What is Ross saying here? I mean, what's Ross doing? Is Ross trying to find Ervil and maybe turn him in? I mean, what's Ross doing?
So Ross himself is one of the people that Ervil is put a hit out. And there's a time where Ervil's hitman actually tried to come to Utah and kill Ross. And so Ross kind of had to stay kind of in hiding as well. Ervil, I think, is not actually directly, I think Ervil's keeping his location kind of more hidden, and he's having his followers go out and be the ones issuing these threats and executing these these death sentences, these murders, cold-blooded murders. And so I don't think Ross could have been in a position to stop Ervil. Maud, at one point, when Ervil's starting to go down this road in the 1970s, before Joel's killed, actually writes a letter to Ervil begging him, saying, I saw your father in a vision at night, and he's deeply concerned about the path that things are heading in this family. And so, Ross kind of felt that his brothers were false prophets, and that they had established kind of a spurious church without divine authority, without true doctrine. And he kind of felt that they were just going down this very dark road because they went down this dark road of apostasy in doctrine, if that makes sense. So what's interesting with Rulon Allred's murder is, did you know that Rulon kind of actually prophesied that he would be killed?
I did. I had a guy on named Charles Orson that really broke that down. He knew Allred when he was a younger man, and so he remembers Rulon making a few claims saying, "Hey, I don't think I'm long for this world."
Yeah. So Rulon actually, in some of his speeches, actually does mention that he says, I think that I might not live very long. Just, be aware that, I could be killed, because these threats that Ervil was making was very public. He was even threatening the head of the LDS Church. I think it was Spencer W. Kimball at that time. And, Spencer W. Kimball had to have additional security because of the threats that Ervil was making. So Rulon, I saw this in an article by one of his daughters, Dorothy Allred Solomon. She wrote that her dad, Rulon, actually wrote in his journal on May 10th, 1975, and she puts in quotes, "I have 2 years to get my affairs in order." The exact quote from the journal. And so I have 2 years to get my affairs in order. 2 years to that exact day, Rulon was killed. So he knew, he had a premonition and a revelation that his time on earth was short, and he wrote it in his journal. So very tragic what happened there. So Ervil finally gets arrested in 1979. He was apprehended by police in Mexico, and he was extradited to the United States, where he was convicted of having ordered Rulon Allred's death. In 1980, he was sentenced to life in prison at the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah, where he ultimately died on August 16th, 1981. So what's interesting is they say that his murder was a suicide, is what his official cause of death is. But from stories that have been told in various circles in fundamentalism, is that Ervil was actually from prison still trying to order hits on people. Like he was actually trying to organize prisoners in prison into his own evil church. His church's name was the Church of the Lamb of God. Totally terrible, taking the name of the Christ Church as given in the Book of Mormon and using it for such evil purposes. So it seems like he was gathering followers in prison, was kind of organizing kind of his own prison church, and this apparently scared and concerned the prison guards enough that's reported that the prison guards actually killed Ervil and made it look like a suicide. Basically got Epstein, right? Which I think he definitely deserved if he was still a threat to people from prison.
I was going to say, I'm not going to shed very many tears for Ervil. So, I mean, he's got this coming.
Yeah, he was, one of the things that his followers did was they actually tried having cars sabotaged, where they would do something to cause the steering to disconnect in vehicles. They would loosen whatever nut is holding it on to the point where it's just barely connecting, the controls of the steering, or something like that. I'm not really a mechanic, so I can't really tell the exact mechanism of how they did it. But basically, they set up people's cars to get into fatal accidents, and Fred Collier actually recalled that he had an experience where he's driving down State Street and all of a sudden his car just veered off, suddenly into a car dealership lot in Salt Lake. And fortunately, he said he was not driving very fast. And so he was able to, hit on the brakes and just barely touch, one of the cars in this car lot. And he went and saw what was done. And he's like, this isn't a ordinary car malfunction. This had to be some sort of sabotage. And so, the Ervil's followers had sent kind of death threats to Ross, to Steve Bjorkman, and to Fred, who were kind of Fred and Steve were the guys who were usually hanging out with Ross LeBaron in the late 1970s. Another person who might have had his car sabotaged is that Rulon Jeffs on the old Fundamentalist Council. Apparently got in a really bad car accident about the same time in the mid 70s, I think. So the question comes up: could he have had his car sabotaged as well? And we do know that this is interesting. This is the very same day that Ervil LeBaron died. His brother Verlin in Mexico, who's the head of Joel's church at that point, Verlin gets killed the exact same day as Ervil in an auto accident in Mexico City. And so, I believe that Verlin probably had his car sabotaged as well, and that's what caused Verlin to get killed. So Verlin, interestingly,
it's really too bad. I've thought about this a little bit. It's too bad there wasn't a way Ervil and Warren Jeffs couldn't have just taken each other out. To me, that would have been the most ideal scenario ever, right? Like, they sabotage Warren's car, and then Warren runs over Ervil, and then Warren runs right off a cliff. I'm like,
and nobody else, nobody else, nobody else, collateral damage.
No, just those two a-holes, just done. That to me would have been the best takeout ever. But
yeah, so what's interesting is Verlin, I understand, was actually very reluctant to lead the church. Like Fred Collier told me he knew Verlin, and he said that Verlin had a really sane head on his shoulders, and that Verlin really didn't want to get involved with being in a leadership position of Joel's church. And so it was very hesitant.
Because your life expectancy becomes that of a fruit fly. I mean, you don't have very long at that point.
Yeah. So Verlin was very hesitant, and apparently this is according to a friend of mine who said he interviewed one of Verlin's sons. He said before Verlin went to Mexico City, which is where he died, he told his sons, "If I don't come back and appoint a successor, then just know that Joel was a good man, but we went barking up the wrong tree. And I do not want you to carry any of this on. Teach your children to honor God and keep his commandments, but do not carry any of this on," i.e. the work that Joel had started. And so this was told by a son who was there at this meeting of Verlin's sons. And he said that Verlin died, less than a week later. And so without appointing a successor, and so this really kind of decapitated the head of I'm sorry to use a morbid analogy, of the Joel LeBaron's church organization, because they centered all their beliefs on priesthood above the church as just being two self-perpetuating offices: the presiding patriarch, which needs to appoint its direct successor, and then the head of the priesthood, the right of the firstborn, which needs to appoint its direct successor. And so with Joel dying without appointing a successor, and Verlin dying without appointing a successor, it left them kind of feeling like they lost full priesthood authority. And it really is a shame that, they were put in this kind of, precarious priesthood situation. It really brings to mind James Strang, and it's taking this idea of the one man doctrine over the priesthood to a very terrible extreme, where you're thinking everything is concentrated in this guy, and if he dies, we are just totally screwed and we don't have any authority. Is kind of, and so Joel really kind of, I felt, paralleled James Strang in this regard, because James Strang taught there was only one prophet. He's so much bigger on everything's concentrated in the prophet than Brigham Young was. Brigham Young said, "I work with a quorum. I have the 12 apostles with me, united in my decisions." I'm not saying that Brigham Young didn't think that he was the guy who was the mouthpiece and the prophet who presided, but he said that his power was from working with other people and not just concentrating everything in himself. In contrast, James Strang really concentrated everything in himself. And he said that to be the prophet of God, you have to be ordained by an angel, after the last prophet dies. You basically have to be ordained the next successor. And so James Strang gets killed by a follower of, a disgruntled former follower. And there isn't somebody who's ordained the next prophet by an angel. And so James Strang's church kind of falls wayward and kind of loses its steam after James Strang's death, and it really just kind of there's a few Strangites left, but it's it never as big as he had several thousand or close to several thousand people at his high point in the early 1850s. So what's interesting is Joel actually similarly got a ton of followers initially. I guess because Joel decided to go big in all of his claims, that apparently was attracted a lot of people to his movement. I also think it might have been the the French missionaries who all became fundamentalists and came back to the United States, and they became big missionaries for Joel's organization, and they converted, I think, hundreds of people. And so I was listening to an interview by one of Reuel Allred's sons, and he mentioned that it was just amazing at that point of time there were so few people this is the early 1960s who accept, most of the fundamentalists stuck with kind of the old council. And he said the number of people who accepted my father, Reuel Allred, could basically all fit in a living room, who accepted his calling and his priesthood claim. And he said the Mexican LeBarons converted tons of people to fundamentalism. But then he said they would go down to Mexico and they got to see kind of the problems down there. And I think, definitely when things went violent, I think that also caused a lot of people to be looking for other places to be, right? That a lot of so the son of Rulon said that a lot of people who were initially attracted to fundamentalism and went down to Mexico and found Joel's church, but then weren't satisfied with it. They eventually a lot of them ended up joining the Allred community, the AUB. And he said that was a big source of the growth of our group indirectly, was from all these people that went that got converted to fundamentalism through the LeBarons, but then decided that they didn't want to follow the LeBarons in Mexico. So some may say that all these problems that that happened under with all this violence that happened with Erbil, does that disprove the LeBaron family's claim to authority? And I would actually say no, not anymore, and not any more than all the problems with the families in Genesis would disprove those families' claims to authority. Or what happened with Lehi's family, where things broke up and there was threats of violence between Laman and Lemuel against Nephi and the other brothers. So a couple quotes on this by a couple of the LeBaron brothers. So Florin one time told his dad, he said, "You have a Laman and Lemuel in your family." And his father Dayer replied, "Yes, but I also have a Nephi, a Jacob, a Joseph, and a Sam." So Ross one time commented in an interview, he said, "It's true that the LeBaron brothers have committed many crimes. So did the sons of Jacob." And Joel LeBaron said, "Just because the sons of Jacob wanted to kill Joseph doesn't prove that Jacob didn't hold the patriarchal office. Just because Cain killed Abel doesn't prove that Adam held no priest authority. And just because Satan has tried to destroy our family completely doesn't prove that Dayer LeBaron held no priest authority. On the contrary, history has shown us that where the power of God is the greatest, there Satan's power is the strongest manifested as well." So there are still I think there's still hundreds of people who believe in Joel's teachings and his claims. There's still some in colonial LeBaron. There's some throughout the United States. There's also other colonies that Joel started, throughout, I think, Mexico, and then going even south of Mexico, as I understand. And so there are still people who believe in Joel's teachings and his claims around. They just, don't think they have, the highest priesthood anymore with their organization. So kind of getting back to Ross LeBaron after that, tangent. Ross initially tried to teaching about the patriarchal priesthood to the two main fundamentalist groups, the Old Council in Short Creek, and then the New Council under Musser. And the AUB were a bit more friendlier to him, I think. They uh, rule according to Ross, Rulin and Owen actually in 1952 kind of asked Musser, they're like, did you ordain Ross to anything? Because Ross's story can kind of raise eyebrows. Did Musser ordain Ross to anything? And Musser says, no, I didn't give him any authority. I just confirmed what he says his dad gave him. Is kind of what the Allreds were. But I think that the Rulin and Owen were not as quite friendly to Ross as say Musser was to Ross and Dayer. They were friendly to a degree in the 1950s and even a little bit later on, but they disagreed with his priesthood line. And so this kind of Bob Eby kind of actually mentions this in some of his stuff. So Bob Eby was part of Musser's School of the Prophets. He was the scribe for many of the AUB meetings, and in a kind of conversation he has with the Allred Council, he kind of mentions that Musser was always friendly to Ross and would let him speak his piece and to respect his right to to share his beliefs. And so I think we should be open to it as well. So the Old Council in Short Creek apparently was less friendly. They kind of told Ross to get the heck out and don't come back. It's kind of what Ross said. So he said that he said that I think Marion Hammond actually was the one who said that to him. And Ross kind of interestingly warned him. He said that when an organization kicks out all the free thinkers and only keeps yes men, it will soon come to an end. And interestingly, what happens is, Hammond and the other council member get dismissed, as the old council under Leroy Johnson and Rulin Jeffs kind of goes in a more centralized, one man rule direction. And so, it is kind of ironic that Ross kind of warned him that, that if you don't permit free thinkers, the organization will eventually come to an end. So Bob Eby, I want to talk a little bit about him since he was a significant early follower of Ross. So Eby kind of felt that he kind of felt that he had a special birthright, and that kind of made him connect with Ross. Eby kind of felt that he was the heir of Levi, and he felt that he was the heir of the Ebionites, which he thought were kind of descended from the tribe of Levi. And so he kind of related to Ross kind of claiming to be the birthright of Joseph Smith. So I already talked about kind of his background. One thing that drew Eby to Ross was Eby hadn't ever received his endowments in the church. And so he really wanted to receive his endowments, but Rulin Allred and Owen Allred at that time basically said, we don't do endowments right now. If you need we only tell people to go get their endowments in the church. And one thing that Eby found attractive about Ross was that Ross claimed to have the authority to do endowments. He said, if you have people who know how to do the ordinances and knowledgeable about how to do them properly, then you can do the ordinances in the right way. And so Bob Eby and Ross eventually did do endowments, and they did also perform second anointings, but generally due to the absence of a temple or even kind of a temporary temple in place like an endowment house, for the most part, LeBaronites focused more on simply ordinations to the keys, and then a man could do temple ordinances for their families as they feel are necessary and are directed to do them. So, but from the beginning in LeBaronism, one thing that, well, I wouldn't say the beginning, but definitely one thing that comes up very early in Ross's ministry is this emphasis on understanding the temple ordinances. And so Ross's students who were attracted to his claims were really big temple ordinance researchers. Ross attracted, besides Bob Eby, other significant researchers and historians in fundamentalism, names such as Fred Collier, Robert Black, Knut Knutson, and Tom Green, who all were, each had, some interest in Mormon history and interest in the researching and understanding the temple ordinances, particularly the endowment ceremony and the second anointing. So to get into some of Ross's unique priesthood teachings that I think are important to understand is that Ross was really kind of, I think, restored this understanding of there being two distinct orders of the Melchizedek priesthood. He said this was in 1967 that he had this revelation that the priesthood of Peter, James, and John and the priesthood of Moses and Elias and Elijah were two distinct orders of Melchizedek priesthood. So Peter, James, and John restored the priesthood of the Son pertaining to the Church of Christ, while Moses, Elias, and Elijah restored the priesthood of the Father, and it was the priesthood of the holy order of God, and thus logically the Church of the Firstborn is the Church of God the Father. And so expounding on this revelation, Ross was able to teach that, the endowment, the four signs and tokens of the endowment represent four different orders of priesthood, two Aaronic orders, and a lower Aaronic and a higher Aaronic, the lower Melchizedek and a higher Melchizedek. And then, so this kind of really kind of restored the knowledge of, these higher orders of priesthood that, kind of like I mentioned, had got lost in Utah Mormonism because the apostles weren't very explicit about teaching it. So in January of 1971, Ross received another revelation about a highest order of priesthood called the Order of the Messiah. And Fred Collier actually wrote about it, this experience and this revelation, in his research journal. So he wrote, Ross's brother Joel claimed to hold the office of Moses or Melchizedek, which he claimed to get from his father, Alma Dayer LeBaron. Ross never could understand this part of Joseph's discourse. What order of priesthood was above the order which Elijah restored? A day or two later, I saw Ross again, and at long last we had his answer. After that evening, after I left Ross, I very earnestly approached God in prayer and asked the Lord to reveal to him the answer to this question, which had so long perplexed him. And God answered his prayer. Light and knowledge poured into his mind concerning that which he desired. The next time I saw Ross, a day or so later, he told me the answer to the question. The fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood that Melchizedek held was the order of the Messiah, which Joseph mentioned in another one of his discourses in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 340. And it's above the spirit and power of Elijah. And this order of priesthood could only be received by a direct revelation from Christ upon another. So Fred continues writing, the proper order of things for receiving this order of priesthood is that man should receive the patriarchal priesthood and his second anointing, and then when it was time, the Lord would appear to him and ordain him to this order of priesthood. When Ross told me this, I remembered reading something about Melchizedek out of a book by John Taylor several months before, which meant nothing to me at the time, but for some reason, even though I did not remember what it said other than it being about Melchizedek and the great powers of the priesthood which he held, I went and got the book out and found the place and read it to Ross. It was in John Taylor's book, Mediation and Atonement. I found that what I was looking for was an excerpt from the inspired version of the Bible by Joseph Smith and an addition which Joseph had added to Genesis 14, verses 26 to 29. Speaking of Melchizedek, it says he was ordained a high priest after the order of the covenant which God made with Enoch, it being after the order of the Son of God, which order came not by man, nor will of man, neither by father nor mother, neither by beginning of days nor end of years, but of God, and was delivered unto men by the calling of his own voice, according to his own will, as unto as many as believed on the same. So this order of the Messiah is the supreme power over the elements that you see in the scriptures that many of the prophets exercise. And according to this, Enoch held this authority, Melchizedek held this authority. We can understand that Noah held this authority because Noah is ordained to the Melchizedek priesthood at a very young age, according to D&C 107. But then if you read in the book of Moses, at a much older age, Noah is ordained after God's order, and he's given this authority. And we know that Moses had this supreme power over the elements. So it's something that it's what Joseph Smith was talking about when Joseph Smith said all the prophets held the Melchizedek priesthood and were ordained by God himself. So, this kind of really restored, some different foundational understandings of priesthood that, Joseph Smith taught, but they really didn't get passed down. I think Brigham Young kind of mentioned the order. Brigham Young would reference this highest priesthood that they didn't have by calling it the keys of creation, to have power over the elements, to be able to command the elements at will. And so, I think Ross really did restore a foundational, important knowledge regarding the different orders of the priesthood. So to get into some other significant doctrinal ideas that I think that Ross and his student Fred Collier received, because I do think that they kind of co-restored a lot of these principles and doctrines. So Fred Collier was.
Let me ask you a couple of questions here real quick, Jacob.
Okay.
On this order of the Messiah, we know that Joseph Smith mentioned it. John Taylor makes mention of it. Do they dive into the kind of detail that Ross and Fred Collier ascribe to it, or are they extrapolating things as they see it?
So I do, there's some extrapolation, but I do think Joseph Smith on March 10th, 1844, says that there is this. So he's talking about the spirit and power of Elias, the spirit and power of Elijah, the spirit and power of Messiah. And he's very explicit that so Elijah is going to be the one to restore the endowments of the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood and place all of the seals on the house of Israel. And then last of all, Messiah comes to his temple and restores all power on heaven, in heaven and earth. So Joseph Smith makes comments about it, but I do think Ross is the one who really puts it together that this is a distinct, order of the priesthood. And when you go back to the book of Moses, you can see it's referenced as this highest order of the Son of God, which Enoch is ordained to, which Melchizedek is ordained to, which Noah is ordained to. So, and they in the book of Moses, and especially the JST Genesis 14, it talks about it having this power over the elements, and that's going off of what Joseph Smith said about it in that Revelation, JST Genesis 14, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So to talk a little bit about Fred Collier, because he's another, I think, significant figure in LeBaron history, especially in connection with Ross LeBaron. So Fred Collier was someone who was born and raised in the LDS Church, and he, according to what his mother said, is that he was probably the most promising deacon as a young man. He was the bishop's favorite deacon and was very into following all of the gospel and trying to obey, everything that is being taught in the church. And Fred was really big on understanding doctrine and getting into talking about Mormonism with other people. He said that this got him into kind of problems when he was a younger guy, and he was just got out of high school and he was starting to have jobs. He wanted to talk about religion, and a lot of jobs aren't too happy about you talking about religion at work. And so Fred actually decided that he would go work for the church, and he ended up working at Deseret Book Bindery. And there he met another individual who comes up in Ross LeBaron history, named Steve Bjorkman. And Steve Bjorkman, his father was a fundamentalist, and but he was working at Deseret Book Bindery, and they were going to throw away some pictures of Brigham Young, and Fred was going to throw these away, and Steve Bjorkman tells him, "Don't throw those away. I know some people who'd want those." And he's like, "Who'd want these kind of slightly misprinted pictures of Brigham Young?" And he goes, "Oh, some polygamists." And Fred's like, "What?" He's like, "Those still exist?" He was like shocked that Steve Bjorkman told him that there were still polygamists in today's day and age. And so Steve kind of started introducing Fred to fundamentalist doctrine. And he said one of the first things he told him is, "Do you know that Brigham Young taught that Adam is God the Father?" And Fred said the first words out of his mouth were, "Bullshit. You prove it." And so Steve goes and gets him an Adam God pamphlet for Fred to read and to see all these different Brigham Young quotes about Adam God. And so Fred, this started Fred to get interested in understanding Mormon history. He goes and he sees all these quotes, and he goes and he actually wants to check out the quotes and make sure the sources are legit. And so he goes to the Journal of Discourses and he sees, yep, Brigham Young said this on this day. He said this on this day. So all the citations were accurate. And he started telling him kind of about, the 1886 revelation and about, fundamentalist authority that had come out of the church. And, Fred started to get interested in researching all this stuff. And it kind of jump-started Fred as being a fundamentalist historian. And Steve had met Ross and, had been ordained by Ross. And Steve is the one who kind of he first took Fred to go to the All Red meeting. to see the Allreds their church meeting. But then he took Fred to meet Ross, and Fred and Ross really connected on doctrine. He said that Ross was more into deep doctrine than anyone else he'd ever met, and they were able to really connect on it. And they talked for probably 7 hours straight, just talking about the deep doctrines of the gospel. So Fred gets ordained by Ross in August of 1970, and he becomes kind of a big player in the LeBaron history. And he's kind of someone who's probably one of the most prolific missionaries, converting people and teaching people about Ross's teachings and teaching about their authority beliefs and about these fundamentalist teachings. And he immediately began researching and writing to help kind of establish this work of the Church of the Firstborn that Ross was trying to establish. So one of the first big revelations that Ross and Fred kind of both had together was a revelation on the importance of the law of adoption being an important practice. And this was in November of 1970. So he said that Ross kind of knew about it as a concept, like so many other fundamentalists knew that they were doing this in early Mormonism, but Ross didn't really see its importance as a social organization. So Fred kind of said, I discovered for myself the Stanley Ivins collection at the Utah State Historical Society, which contained a substantial file on adoption. When I got hold of the John D. Lee report of the February 16th and 17th, 1847 family meetings where Brigham Young gives his most in-depth speech on the law of adoption, it was like revelation from heaven. It was revelation from heaven. The Spirit of God came upon me and the horizons of my mind were expanded. He said, he said, the Spirit of God lit my mind up like a Christmas tree. I brought it to Ross and I read it to him, and immediately afterwards entered into a covenant to be his adopted son. And they said, ultimately, the rule of thumb became all things else being equal, a convert would be adopted to the man who brought him into the work. And after this, adoption covenants always preceded ordination to the patriarchal priesthood. The policy being that the individual to whom you were adopted would be the mouth in the ordination. For patriarchal priesthood was a lineal order and was supposed to pass down from father to son. And so this is when adoption became like a big part of kind of the Ross LeBaron social order. And it was interesting enough to Verlin that when Verlin wrote the LeBaron story, he wrote that this was kind of part of what his brother Ross taught about, his priesthood teachings. So Fred wrote quite a bit on adoption. I think Fred was very significant to getting the law of adoption to be understood by many fundamentalists. And he wrote, papers that kind of explained it. And one of my favorite quotes explaining the law of adoption came from Fred in a paper he gave in 1986 and 1987. He said, in the first endowments that were given at Nauvoo, when you received the fullness of the gospel, you entered into the divine family, and some man on earth would become your father. He'd be responsible to teach you about the principles whereby you could become like God, and he would be a father to you whether or not he was by blood. Children born under the covenant to parents who were faithful to all the laws of God were not under necessity of seeking out such a father. But men who were born outside of the covenant, who were born to unfaithful parents, they had to find other parents who were in the covenant. This is because in the celestial family there are no dead limbs, nor are there any branches that have been cut off the tree. In the celestial family, you are alive and vibrant in the living of the gospel, and in every way you are eternally connected into your genealogical tree, into the divine family. Either this or you have no place in the celestial family at all. Ultimately, those who are not born to parents who are vibrant in the fullness of the gospel must be sealed to other parents who are. In this sense, children sometimes become as talents, which are taken from unfaithful parents and given to other parents that are worthy. This is the law of adoption, or the sealing of men to men. So this was, a big part of, in my opinion, when I look back at Mormon history, on the Trek West, they were trying to organize the saints into the law of adoption. This is kind of how they were trying to get the saints established into this higher family order. But obviously, when they came to Utah, there's statements where they said that this, they felt that the majority of the saints weren't ready for the higher organization of the kingdom of God. So another significant revelation came just a month later, and it's a revelation on understanding why there were two distinct churches. Why do we have both the Church of Jesus Christ and the Church of the Firstborn in the gospel program? Because Ross kind of would explain it as there are two distinct churches, but the Church of Jesus Christ is a Gentile order. The Church of the Firstborn is a patriarchal order. But Fred's mind, when he's trying to teach people, he says this doesn't really fully explain it. And so Fred says that one time when he's teaching somebody, he actually got a revelation that kind of outlined this greater understanding of this two-tiered restoration of the gospel. He said, I received a revelation that the Church of Jesus Christ was for the salvation of mankind, while the Church of the Firstborn was for the exaltation of man, and that the family-related temple ordinances had to do with the Church of the Firstborn, while baptism, the sacrament, and other ordinances had to do with the Church of Christ. From that time on, I began to receive revelations about the Church of the Firstborn and the priesthood. So Fred said after he got this revelation, he actually called up Bob Eby on the phone and told him this new idea that he felt he got from inspiration. And Bob Eby, who had been a follower of Ross for 13 years, he kind of said, I've got a lot of quotes collected on the Church of the Firstborn. I'm pretty sure I have a quote that contradicts you on this. And so Fred's like, okay, go ahead, show it. And so Eby goes and grabs his binder, and they're on the phone, and Eby finds the quote, and it's a Brigham Young quote, and Brigham Young says, the ordinances of the house of God are expressly for the Church of the Firstborn. And Fred goes, that doesn't contradict it. That confirms that the temple ordinances are expressly for the Church of the Firstborn. So Fred said that Ross was a little bit slower to accepting this new idea, but that on August 7th, 1974, that Ross also accepted it, and he was able to write it down as a revelation that Ross agreed with and that Ross believed was true. So Fred wrote this in his research journal. Revelation received through Patriarch Ross Wesley LeBaron, August 7th, 1974. A man obtains the right to salvation through demonstrating that he's willing to live harmoniously in a society which is governed by the priesthood of God. A man obtains exaltation by organizing a society of his own under the priesthood and according to the laws and ordinances of the holy order of God, the same as all the gods have done before us. It is the primary purpose of the Church of Jesus Christ to offer salvation to all mankind by teaching them the necessary social laws of love and respect, which, when incorporated into our lives, enable us to live in a state of harmony in the kingdom of God. Through the atonement of Christ, salvation is offered as a free gift to all those who demonstrate they will live accordingly. It is the primary purpose of the Church of the Firstborn to offer mankind exaltation by opening their minds to a knowledge of the laws and ordinances of the holy order of God, and by offering them an opportunity to receive the same through the authority of the priesthood, that they might have the privilege of entering into their exaltation. So this was another key thing that I think really, and so many people in fundamentalism, just that rings so true, that so many people accept that idea that you have kind of a two-tiered restoration of the gospel of salvation at the church level, then the gospel of exaltation, which is the higher level through the temple ordinances and those higher priesthood organizations. So to talk a little bit about Ross and some of his other aspects of his ministry and his teachings and his eccentricities. So Ross was really, really big on free agency. He called it, the foundational principle of the universe. And he said the greatest principle ever revealed was the patriarchal family organization, including polygamy at the top. Connected with that principle is how a man should treat a woman to keep her happy and exalt her and her children. And then he goes on, he says, when you get into the family organization, the first great principle after you learn it is that the gods have to allow the greatest free agency possible. If they didn't, people wouldn't go with them at all. People want all the free agency they can. So he says it's very important to have free agency, but you can't have he says, but free agency doesn't mean what everyone thinks it does. Perfect free agency means absolutely no ties, no responsibility, and nobody owes you anything, and you owe nobody and nothing. So free agency isn't what people think it is. The perfect free agency is to be able to have your free agency first, and then you make a trade. What you have to offer for someone else is what someone else has to offer to you. So he goes on, and Ross was really big on the Adam God doctrine. He's really big on the belief that Joseph Smith was the Holy Ghost, which we've talked about. You on a previous podcast talked about how Joseph Musser really was the primary guy who established those ideas among fundamentalism, and Ross was a really big believer in both of those ideas. So Ross, after kind of being not being on the best terms with the different fundamentalists, they grew tired of him, kind of teaching his claims in their groups. One thing that Ross would do, and was a big part of his ministry, was that he would actually go on KSXX radio and do a radio show to kind of, and what he tried to do was he tried to talk about the gospel, but he also tried to be a bit eccentric, where he wanted to talk about things in a kind of controversial way to keep people entertained, and to, he'll get them kind of entertained or riled up on whatever controversial thing he would say. And then he would also kind of mix in different aspects of the fullness of the gospel with it. And for example, Tom Green told me that he knew about Ross's radio show long before he kind of became converted to Ross's teachings. He said that he heard Ross on the radio. He said that, that Adam had a flying saucer and flew around, and that he, was kind of the God of this world. And Tom kind of thought the flying saucer part was a bit weird, but the Adam God part, when Tom became a fundamentalist, he realized, oh, he was including kind of this Adam God aspect to this idea. So Ross was a bit eccentric. He was big into belief in UFOs. He actually believed that he had the perfect design for a UFO. He actually made he had a patent for a UFO toy that actually, I think, got made by a company called Whammo. I'm not sure if that toy actually is still around or not, but that's actually how Fred first met Ross. Steve kind of told him he's going to be at this park launching his UFOs at the park, and so look at it's a big park in Salt Lake, and look for where the UFOs are coming from. These big things, flying saucers flying through the air. And he said that's how he was able to find Ross. And so Ross was a bit eccentric. He liked UFOs. He believed that that God used technology as part of God's work, and he believed that Ezekiel, when he talks about the spinning wheels and on fire in the sky, that he thought that Ezekiel was kind of referencing that, that describing a UFO was kind of what Ross's belief was on that. And Ross kind of mixed in these eccentric things with his radio ministry to kind of keep it interesting. Another thing that Ross was big on was he was also big on prophetic guessing, where trying to guess the prophetic dates when XYZ thing would happen, important events would happen. I think it was kind of influenced by another fundamentalist called Francis Darder, who was also very big in those kinds of ideas. And Ross actually said he and Francis Darder actually wrote several pamphlets together. And Darder, I think, also influenced Ross to be believing in this Lamanite prophet idea, which was kind of big in the early part of fundamentalism, was that this idea that there was a secret Lamanite prophet that had the keys. So one kind of funny story that Fred Collier told about Ross on the radio show was one time that Ross called on the Joan Thomas radio show, and the topic was it was about the time of the execution of Gary Gilmore. This woman was always speaking out for women's rights to abortion and birth control, and she was very much against the renewal of capital punishment in Utah and the execution of this man. And this too, in spite of the fact that this man had literally requested execution. As she said before the execution, she was going to go home and pull her blinds and sit in the dark the day of his execution. Gilmore was a convicted killer with several times over, and he wanted to die. Nevertheless, this lady was against reinstating the death penalty, yet she was all for killing the unborn. Anyway, Ross called up on her show one day and stated, "Abortion for the godless, birth control for the apathetic, and polygamy for all of my friends." Needless to say, this comment incensed Thomas and drew out all kinds of calls from her sympathetic listeners. And so, Ross really had fun going on the radio, and Fred felt that was, that's how Ross felt was the best way to kind of spread his ideas to others, was through the medium of radio at that time. I remember one radio recording of Ross that was kind of interesting, where a person called on and wanted to kind of bash the LDS church leaders over not being able to detect the Hoffman forgeries. And Ross kind of got after them for that. He said, "Are you here trying to make fun of the LDS church leaders?" And Ross actually said it was kind of rude to try to be doing that. He says, "You only get revelations from God that God gives you, And you can't expect someone to know something unless God gives it to them. So he says, you shouldn't expect somebody to be able to detect every single fraud or every single, you know, thing like that. You go back to Joseph Smith and the Kinderhook plates, that same principle applies. You know, God didn't give it to Joseph to understand it. And Joseph, when he looked at it and he went and he pulled out the Egyptian alphabet and grammar and was like trying to match the characters on these fake plates with the characters that he got from the Egyptian papyri and the translation of those characters that he had at that time. So Fred got another big revelation I think is very important to the concept of the Church of the Firstborn. It was a series of revelations in 1983 on the principle that Fred would call the principle of total commitment. And he says that it's really something you can't understand outside of the context of the concept of celestial love, that absolute selfless, not looking for your own benefit, but looking to uplift others. And the key, it was a series of revelations, but the most important one to Fred was a vision that he was given during this time period. He said, I saw people dressed in white robes standing on long tiers. There were people standing on tiers. They were standing side by side, about arm's length, probably a little more apart. There were fathers and mothers and children and grandchildren going down. Parents were one tier above their children, and immediately behind them, grandparents were two tiers above their grandchildren and one tier above their children. The tiers were all kind of circular. And the only words associated with this dream was they were all one like the weave of a cloth. But a concept was put into my mind. The most literally, this concept was beyond this world. It was utterly beautiful. Without words, God put into my mind a concept of union that's the most beautiful thing that I'd ever thought of. When I experienced this, most literally, God wrote this celestial law into my heart and mind. It's changed my whole life and focus, the way I think and perceive things. And so he kind of explained it on another occasion that it was revealed that the core thing that makes heaven heaven is the perfect heavenly union that exists between those who are exalted as gods in the celestial kingdom. That if they didn't have this perfect union, then it wouldn't be all that great. It wouldn't be heaven. And so it was this core idea that we need to, in our celestial family relationships, need to be striving to have this perfect union and really this complete commitment to our eternal family relationships. And that is what makes an eternal marriage and makes a eternal father-son relationship an eternal father-son relationship. And so this was really kind of in what the way Fred said it. He said they were all one like a weave of the cloth, and notwithstanding this, in accordance with what I saw, the concept that was communicated to my mind and my heart, all the members of the family had perfect freedom and individuality, and all the union was by love and respect and desire from heart and mind. There was no coercion to this. And he said that it was, all these everyone perfectly lives this. He says the law of consecration together in the celestial kingdom, that you live it with your family, and that you need to be developing those perfectly committed family relationships. And that while authority, just like authority for a baptism is important, a baptism, just getting baptized without any spiritual aspect to it, repentance and accepting Christ and trying to, live according to his teachings, a baptism without what's in your heart and mind isn't going to affect anything. It's really what's at the core of, why you're doing the ordinance that makes the ordinance valid. And so similarly, Fred would say this was the core of an eternal marriage covenant. The authority is important. The ordinance to be eternally sealed is important, but the core of it needs to be that perfect union and that absolute striving to have an eternal relationship and to make that be an eternal family relationship. And so he said this vision and experience really kind of changed his outlook on the Church of the Firstborn and what had been taught up to that time, because there was this attitude among some of the people who were ordained by Ross, that they get ordained and they go off and kind of do their own little thing. And there wasn't really a strong concept of union. And even among parents and children, fathers and sons, there wasn't really the strong concept of union. And this experience really put it into Fred's heart and mind that this union is absolutely vital and important to establish those kinds of, celestial relationships. And that's what we really need to strive for in order to, be worthy of the celestial kingdom. So after having this experience, Fred kind of said that he was kind of shocked that Ross, very shortly after Fred had these experiences, that Ross kind of went backwards in some of his doctrinal teachings. And there are Ross LeBaronites who accept these other teachings, and I want to talk about them in as respectful as a way as I can, but I want to be accurate in describing them and saying why I disagree with these new teachings. So about 1983, 1984, Ross began to change his foundational priesthood teachings in some major ways. Instead of his family receiving the keys down from Joseph Smith to Benjamin F. Johnson, just kind of preserving, this line coming down, the priesthood line ideas in Ross's mind changed, that actually Benjamin F. Johnson had a new dispensation of priesthood given in the Nauvoo temple, which is, he said that the fullness of the priesthood was restored by Elijah and God the Father to Benjamin F. Johnson in the Nauvoo temple. And this would be called the Nauvoo Restoration in Ross's theology. And he basically was saying, we are a completely different eighth dispensation. We are not really connected to Joseph Smith's authority. And this is obviously a very controversial thing to claim, to be saying that your priesthood authority is a completely separate dispensation from Joseph Smith's priesthood authority, if that makes sense.
Where's he getting this? What is this? Because this is distinct, I think, in Mormon fundamentalism for sure. This idea that Joseph kind of completed his dispensation. Now there's a new dispensation. Where is he getting this? What is it that is behind that? Did he find something? Did he receive some sort of revelation? What was it?
So Ross, Fred says it was actually reading in Andy Ehat's thesis, unfortunately, because Fred would say Andy Ehat's thesis on the institution of temple ordinance is actually a very great thesis. But there's a statement in there about where Joseph Smith spoke of Elijah's return futuristically in the Nauvoo period, where he says, we are waiting for Elijah to come and restore the authority. There's several. Joseph Smith throughout the Nauvoo period spoke futuristically about Elijah coming and restoring the covenants to seal the hearts of the fathers to the children, etc. And so Ross looked at those statements, and he also connected it with D&C 124, saying that there isn't a house on the earth for the fullness of the priesthood to be restored to you. And so Ross kind of in his mind connected these ideas that there needed to be a second restoration of the priest of Elijah's authority for a patriarchal dispensation. It's that's how Ross interpreted it. My personal, I disagree with those interpretations of Joseph Smith's statements. I believe Joseph Smith always spoke futuristically about Elijah's return, because the Nauvoo temple, the Kirtland restoration, D&C 110, was a secret through Joseph Smith's lifetime. And so he always spoke kind of futuristically, quoting Malachi's prophecy, just because it was, not yet known to the saints. And he basically, I think Joseph was initially waiting for the Nauvoo temple to be completed to reveal to them that these higher priesthood keys were committed in the Kirtland temple. And it was supposed to be in the temple where the saints were supposed to get the fullness of the priesthood, through the endowment ordinances, the second anointing. But, Joseph had a revelation that he had promptings that he might not live to see the temple completed. And so he had revelation directing him to give, the endowments and the fullness of the priesthood to others before the temple was completed. And so I think Ross took those statements, out of context to come up with this new theology. And there's different perspectives on looking at, at Ross's doing this. Like, I think the nicest way I think you could look at it is Ross was getting old in his mind, and he might have been having age affect his mind. There's, as one of your previous interviews said, men in their old age can sometimes do the darndest thing. And I do think that this was a big factor for why the church leaders dropped so many things after the manifesto. Was after 1890, these guys were a bunch of very old guys, and maybe their minds weren't all entirely there, and they, drop rebaptism, they drop adoption, they defended Adam God initially after the manifesto in 1891, but then, only 4 years later, they're at General Conference like, don't worry about who Adam is, who Jehovah is, who Elohim is. Just, it was the exact opposite attitude, And so I do wonder if senility might have affected the leaders in causing, or, something to do with their minds not being as sharp in their old age might have affected the LDS church leaders in the 1890s that might have contributed to some of the doctrinal decline. And one thing that I would point to that I think is evidence of this is a friend of mine told me that he heard about the Matthias Cowley diaries in the Church History Library. I understand are restricted. You can't actually see what's in Matthias Cowley's diaries, but somebody who got to see through the Matthias Cowley diaries said that there was something there in the early 1910s where Matthias Cowley is kind of complaining that he's trying to talk to Joseph F. Smith about some of the appointments, about some of the things he said. And he says Joseph F. Smith isn't remembering the conversations that we've had. And so maybe Joseph F. Smith's kind of halfway thing on plural marriage near the end, where he was saying, he could have been having some issues with his own memory, if that makes sense.
Does Fred try to push against this at all coming from Ross?
So yes, there are 3 followers of Ross who couldn't accept these newer ideas on priesthood. And I would say the 3 followers were Bob Eby, Robert Black, and Fred Collier, and they each kind of had their own different take on things. Eby kind of felt that Ross had fallen into pride a few years earlier, and that Ross initially wasn't so big on the titles. He said the honor is in the work, not the titles. But by 1978, Ross has basically claiming to be the one mighty and strong, and he is wanting them all to sustain him as the one mighty and strong. And Robert Black told me, so I've done extensive interviews with Robert Black. I've had lots of long conversations with Fred Collier. I've had several long conversations with Tom Green, kind of getting their different perspectives on the history of Ross LeBaron. And Robert kind of told me that he felt that it was this 1978 is when Ross wanted them to sustain him as the one mighty and strong. And Ed Alder kind of raised his arm to the square and said, Ross, you are going to destroy this work if you go down this path. And Robert recalled that Ross said, was that a prophecy? And Ed Alder raised his arm to the square and said, I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. And so there was this, and Robert said that, and the only person there that really, really wanted to sustain Ross was Steve Bjorkman. That Fred's attitude, he said Fred stuck around and tried to turn Ross around after that. He said that Fred's response was, and Fred also told me this was his response. He said, Ross, you have the keys. You just need to do the work. It's not about the title. It's about what work you're doing with your authority. And Robert told me that he felt that, Ross had made different prophecies earlier on in his life that were right on several different occasions. He said that none of Ross's prophecies after this meeting came true. And he kind of made some embarrassing predictions after that time period. But he said that Fred kind of stuck around trying to turn Ross around in his mind. And, so Robert would say he felt that Ross kind of became a bit too prideful, and that caused him to lose the spirit. Fred kind of thought that he had a conversation with Ross shortly after he had his dream vision experience, that he took Ross out to dinner and he tried to talked to Ross about celestial love, because he said Ross was really big in this belief in competition. He said that was my one doctrinal difference with Ross, was that Ross really believed that competition was kind of a key force in the universe. And Fred said that from his own experiences and revelations, he felt that love was the most foundational principle of the universe, that the biggest motivation that God has is his love for us and his love for others, and trying to uplift them to be what he is. And so Fred said before he would share Ross this idea of this principle of total commitment, that he wanted to convince him on the doctrine of celestial love, because you can't really have total commitment with somebody who sees you as competition and will take advantage of you. And so he took Ross out to dinner to talk about the principle, he didn't even tell him about his vision. He says it wasn't even worth it getting to that point unless we were on the same page about celestial love. And they got in a big kind of heated argument about this concept. And it got to the point that Ross got so vehement and so ingrained in his own position that Fred was like, Ross, I witnessed with my own eyes when I was a young man, a mother bear basically sacrifice her life for her own cubs. She was willing to be killed to try to protect her babies. So why wouldn't Jesus Christ have that same kind of selfless love for us? He's not doing it for his own benefit and for his own, because he's in competition with others. And he said that Ross got so vehement, he actually said that Christ died for his own glory, to be the second person of the Trinity. And Fred was like, whoa, that's heavy. And Fred felt that was blasphemy against the atonement on that occasion. And he just sunk his head in disappointment when, that was Ross's kind of response to him trying to discuss this principle of celestial love with him. And he said he felt that Ross went in the dark because he went so far as to blaspheme the atonement on that occasion, if that makes sense. And like I said, part of it, I think old age could have been a factor. Ross is very old, and some people, Amasa Lyman started denying the atonement of Christ later on in his life as an apostle, and some of his family thought that maybe he was going senile, and that kind of contributed to him having, getting twisted up in his mind. And so Fred has made comments that he doesn't want to judge Ross harshly, and he thinks, that he thinks Ross did a very important work, and that Ross laid so many important principles and foundations that have very important ministry, but that he got wrong in doctrine and kind of fell in the dark before his death. There are other people who think that Ross was always big into entertaining different new ideas, and there are people who accept Ross's new priesthood teachings as valid. And I do think Ross kind of expressed these teachings in a 1985 pamphlet he did called Priesthood Expounded. And I will say, I've kind of said this, his ideas are kind of screwed up in there. He's got a bunch of these newer ideas kind of twisted in. And so if you see something that doesn't make sense, it's probably one of the newer ideas. But there is also a lot of genius stuff in there as well. So Ross didn't all of a sudden just lose all inspiration that he had previously had. He just started to get kind of darkened in his mind in some things. He started to change, his beliefs about priesthood, and, started to teach different things and say that his former teachings weren't correct, etc. And, Ross kind of at one point mentioned that Fred felt that, that he had fallen. He said that Ross's kind of defense was that Joseph Smith changed his ideas on different things and developed them over time. And so why can't I change and develop my ideas, is kind of what Ross said. But for Fred, his big thing was that Ross's teachings, he felt, were so true to Joseph Smith's teachings that weren't being taught about elsewhere. Ross was really big on this idea of there being a patriarchal priesthood, which so few, he said, no one in the church talks about that, and very few of the fundamentalists talk about it. And this idea of there being all these, the priesthood foundation that Ross taught, Fred would later find lots of documents in the archives that would really substantiate a lot of these different ideas. And so, Ross, Fred still gave credit for all the good things that Ross taught. And he said that my goal when following Ross's teachings is because they were true to what Joseph Smith had taught about priesthood and about doctrine. And so when Ross starts going off into a different direction that's not quite fitting what Joseph Smith taught, I'm going to stick more with what Joseph Smith taught. And that's really, a big part of Fred's ministry, was going into the archives and publishing tons of new material that had never been published, lots of new Adam God sermons that had never been published. He's published 10 different thick books on different aspects of church history. He's published over 40 different pamphlets on doctrine, and 20. He probably has 20 others that never were published or printed. And he was really big into digging up what was Joseph Smith's secret teachings about authority and about priesthood. And he felt Ross did such a great job in kind of passing down a lot of these foundational ideas. So, some people, can have a problem with this idea that, can a prophet fall into the dark? But I think Joseph Smith's teachings and revelations warn about that. It's in the Joseph Smith translation of the New Testament, where it says, if your eye who sees for you becomes corrupted, you need to pluck him out, and it's referencing, if a church leader ends up, changing his, ends up becoming corrupt in his doctrine. This is something that Brigham Young hinted at over and over again, saying, well, my biggest fear is that the Latter-day Saints could be led by one man to utter destruction. And so there is this, there's this idea in early Mormonism that that a prophet could fall. And, you actually see that in the Doctrine and Covenants with Joseph Smith, where D&C 43 says, if Joseph Smith falls, he will appoint someone else in his stead to carry on. He will have no other power but to appoint someone else to carry on, his work. And, so Joseph Smith actually did that with David Whitmer, where he ordained David Whitmer to be his successor in case he did fall. But ironically, David Whitmer is the one who fell, while Joseph Smith stayed true and received greater light and knowledge. So Fred kind of believed that the Lord, similar to how, the Lord passed the mantle onto Ross, that he felt that the Lord kind of passed the mantle of revelation onto him after Ross. And so Fred really tried to carry on a lot of these teachings and kind of perpetuate them in his family circles and those who, stumble upon his writings and want to be taught by him. I think both Ross and Fred were extremely gifted men when it came to teaching and sharing the principles of the gospel. But I don't think they fully magnified themselves as leaders. I think Fred mentioned that Ross was such an individualist, he never really led anyone. He just kind of would teach people and enjoyed having the friendly association. And, I think Fred kind of in a similar way was way more of a teacher than a leader. Lots of people appreciated Fred teaching, so much on doctrine. When the AUB wanted to start doing endowments, they actually reached out to Fred wanting to know what research he had on the endowment ceremony because they were trying to start doing those things. And so a lot of people throughout fundamentalism appreciate, Fred's teachings. And I would just kind of say one thing that Fred would say is that Joseph Smith at the October 1840 General Conference said that the priesthood is the channel through which all knowledge, doctrine, the plan of salvation, and every important matter is revealed from heaven. And so Fred felt that Ross, by getting some significant revelations on priesthood, and then he also getting some revelations that built upon the foundation Ross did, was kind of demonstrating this kind of idea of the priesthood should be the channel through which important revelation should come to the Latter-day Saints. So, yeah, do you want to kind of get into anything else? I think that
yeah, I got a couple questions. Was that the bulk of what you wanted to go over there, Jacob?
Yeah, we kind of went some different directions this time, but I do think we covered a lot of important history.
So let me ask you this: what at any one time was the organization that Ross started, the Church of the Firstborn, was it organized in any sort of meaningful way? Right? Did you have places of meeting? Were there temples? Any of those things?
So it was a very loose association where it was very informal and very loose. And, when I've been working on my own kind of history of LeBaronism currently. And I was dividing it up into different sections and different parts. I was wanting to, compiling a section on Ross and Fred. And I was writing Fred at one time entitled the pamphlet, The Restoration of the Church of the Firstborn. And I liked that. And I thought that might be a good heading. But then I realized, what I really consider that Ross did was restored the knowledge of the Church of the Firstborn, and he perpetuated this patriarchal priesthood that had been passed down, these priesthood keys pertaining to the temple, and he set men apart to this authority. And so it really was a very loose organization under Ross. And Fred, that was one of Fred's, kind of disagreements with how things were run. Ross kind of made a comment once that he's like, I'm kind of glad I don't have a ton of followers like my brothers did, because otherwise I wouldn't have any time for myself to study and think, is kind of what Ross thought. He liked having alone time to ponder on things and to think about doctrine. And he wasn't really too big on being a leader. Fred said Ross was really more of an individualist, and those who were drawn to Ross were very individualist people, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you this. What is the state of, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call it LeBaronism? What's the state of it today? What does it look like? Has it grown? Has it shrunk? What does it look like today?
So, I would say that, there are really kind of two main groups that tried to, two main lines that tried to carry on Ross's ideas. There's Fred, who tried to kind of say, I'm carrying out the earlier Ross teachings that I feel are consistent with Joseph Smith's teachings. And then Tom Green kind of was a guy who was true to Ross's ideas to the end, and he really, really tried to defend Ross's later theology. And Tom kind of got a bit more of an organization in the early 2000s, where he actually got quite a bit of, he got on the internet, he got in touch with quite a bit of different fundamentalists, and he actually started to kind of ordain a lot of men as patriarchs and kind of get them kind of organized to a degree under him. But Tom ended up going to prison for some of the things he did, and his organization kind of disintegrated, partly because Tom it was so loosely fragmented that different people kind of just felt they could just go their different directions. And Fred kind of in the early 90s kind of started his own organization. But I do feel like, Fred gathered quite a bit of people over the years. Tom probably converted dozens. I think Fred probably converted hundreds to LeBaronism. But Fred wasn't really as gifted as a leader as he was a theologian. And so some people have issues with some of Fred's teachings, like on, say, the principle of total commitment and the celestial family order, because Fred was less than perfect in his leadership of his family circle. And, I would just point out that we don't reject plural marriage and D&C 132 just because Joseph was less than perfect in his application of plural marriage. D&C 132 speaks about Joseph having some sins and transgressions that Emma need, and trespasses that Emma should forgive Joseph for. So, Joseph wasn't as, completely perfect either. But I do think that both, these different men who were ordained by Ross did try to continue this idea of this patriarchal family order in their own different ways. That there was Tom, who tried to do his organization. Fred tried to do his organization that was trying to be have a bit more organization, a bit more structure than what Ross was initially doing. And then there were also other men who were just ordained as patriarchs by Ross, who just stayed as independent patriarchs. And so there are actually quite a bit of kind of independent Ross LeBaronite patriarchs out there who are just kind of trying to carry on this family order kind of idea in their own right, if that makes sense. So, I got into Fred's kind of family order, and I absolutely loved the doctrine, and I thought Fred was absolutely an extremely gifted teacher and very generous with his time. There's nobody that would reach out to him with a doctrinal question that, sincerely, that he wouldn't take a significant amount of time to answer their question and put in effort to try to find, whatever quotes or whatever historical sources to answer their questions. When I got, involved with Fred in 2015, I saw that he had all this great doctrine, but he still didn't really have quite an organization. He had several loose families that were associated with him who accepted, the teachings that as he published and taught them, and, as they fit with what Joseph Smith was teaching about, the Church of the Firstborn in Nauvoo. But it wasn't really a full organization. And so, I really felt I wasn't really looking to, for authority. I was just looking for, when I became a fundamentalist, I was looking for people who believe all of these old doctrines. I was like, who's got the old doctrines and who's also got kind of new ideas and new revelations that build on those old ideas. And I really was drawn to, some of Fred's ideas and his writings that, kind of build upon the Adam God doctrine and offer kind of different insights and perspectives into different aspects of early Mormon theology. And so I got ordained to the priesthood by Fred. And for me, when I got ordained, I kind of had an attitude that I needed to be, that a priesthood is more of a responsibility than, a lot of people are really just seeking, authority to say I have authority, but I think priesthood is more responsibility than just authority by itself. And so I felt a responsibility to try to understand all of this history and understand this doctrine, and really to try to be a missionary, to try to, help share this with other people. And, that, there were some other people that kind of were involved with doing that, but, there were some, issues with Fred's family circles. I'm not going to go too much into all of the issues that are there, but I would just say that eventually me and my wife ended up kind of having our own, personal distancing ourselves from some of those issues that were coming up in Fred's family that I think personally contributed, to his work not really coming to full fruition, if that makes sense. I think that, temple ordinances are absolutely super important and should be treated with kind of the utmost respect. And I think that, unfortunately, some individuals who haven't experienced temple ordinances in a temple don't understand, how respectful you should treat those ordinances. I think that another thing that, and this is something that applies to fundamentalism in general, but I think I apply it to my own backyard, is I think that when sexual abuse happens in our communities, it should be treated severely. It should be reported to police. I do think that, to be honest, so I've interviewed, did lots of historical conversations with Fred, conversations with Tom Green, conversations with Robert Black. I actually point blank told Tom Green when I first reached out to him that, because he actually kept sparking conversations with me, and I kind of eventually was like, because you went to prison for an underage marriage, I've just always kind of, felt to, keep my distance because of that, and I just kind of said, just so you know, I don't sanction those kinds of things. And that was literally my first private conversation with him. And Tom Green's response was, there are some fundamentalists who have either been friends with Tom or received authority from Tom, who will defend, defend what Tom did. And it's for me, Tom Green didn't defend his actions when I interacted with him. He said they were a mistake. I shouldn't have done things the way I did things, and I paid the price for what I did. And so Tom Green was repentant for what he did. And so I do think that we need to, and our communities do need to, make it clear that some of these things that have happened in the past are unacceptable and shouldn't be defended, shouldn't be continued. Just like with the problems with arranged marriages, and kind of, what was going on with some of the fundamentalists in the mid 1900s. I think that we should learn lessons from our history and try to bring forth the best possible version of, what we believe to be true and what we believe to be doctrinal, if that makes sense.
That makes a ton of sense. And I want to commend you for going there, because I know that that's a little uncomfortable. And that's good. I'm glad you went there. And I agree with you. We can't tolerate that anymore. I think for a long time there was this idea of just turning a blind eye, and that hasn't gotten us anywhere except in more pain and more suffering. And anytime you use the gospel to inflict that kind of pain and suffering, you're just begging to you're just begging for God's judgment. And we have to root that out at every step, every level. I don't care if it's the LDS Church or if it's fundamentalism. It's got to go. Those days have to end. Let me ask you this: as I
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
So yeah, I would say, I still, I'll come up because, I felt like, I totally absolutely respect all of Fred's great theological and historical work. But like I said, some of the things that, he has kind of turned a blind eye to in his own family circle, and I would say it's, issues with nepotism are, things that, I couldn't sustain, and that I think that we as fundamentalists do need to do better. We will point to and the LDS Church needs to do better as well. When the stories that have come out in recent years of things that have happened and how things were handled in certain cases in the LDS Church, and we can't, we'll point to the Catholics and talk about how corrupt and how wrongly they are for for covering up all the systematic abuse that's happened. But if it's in, your own community, your own faith community, if it's in your own family circle, you need to be, if you're going to criticize that in other communities, you need to be, not covering it up in your own circle. And, we need to do better in that regard. And, I think a lot of fundamentalists are in agreement that we should do better in those kinds of things.
Look,
So
I don't say this haphazardly. I'm dead serious. If where I worship at was engaged in any of that, you can take it to the bank. This microphone would get hot in a big damn hurry. And that's just the way it is. I care, as we all should. We should care so much about what Joseph did. And I just got done being at Carthage jail, right? This is a guy who laid down his life for this. If we don't have at least that same kind of passion for this, if we do, we should be willing to call our own selves out when something's bad is happening, and then be able to root that out so it doesn't become systemic within any organization or any belief system. So no, I couldn't agree with you more. Let me ask you this real quick. As I look around now and I see LeBaronism, it's really kind of fractured. And I'm not saying that to attack or criticize or anything like that, but it does raise the question of what's the future hold? What do you see the future being for LeBaronism now? Because it's very, very, very fractured. How is it? Is that the destiny that it's going to always have? Is just being fragmented everywhere?
well, I think that Fred had some good ideas on improving kind of the concepts that Ross taught. As Fred would say, that Ross had a great doctrinal foundation, but he didn't have the full house of how these ideas were to ultimately be organized into. I do think that Ross had some ideas about organization, but he didn't fully develop them. I do think that Fred, by going back and kind of looking at early church history, and also, study, what Brigham Young and John Taylor believed about these higher principles, that, there is supposed to be, union is a very important principle. And it's really what gave Brigham Young and the apostles that followed him the power that they had to come out west and to accomplish all the great things that they did. And, you know, I see absolute benefit to the family organization in this decentralization of authority and power being spread out among lots of families. You know, there's a benefit to that because you can't be led by one man to all go and err the same way. But, you know, the downside to the looseness, the lack of, the lack of being united and organized is that you can't get as much done and you can't accomplish as great of things as you could if you were organized. Joseph Smith repeatedly in the last years of his life would say that union is power. And he was always talking about how the saints needed to be united to accomplish the work that the Lord intended for them to do. And so, and that's kind of why Brigham Young was successful. And I think that these other guys who went off in their own different directions, even though they felt justified under the kingdom building ideas to go set up their own churches, ultimately, all of the churches that were set up that didn't really follow Brigham Young, they all really withered away, and most of them disappeared. Like, there is no real trace of Lyman White's colony, and it's a shame that he didn't answer the call to come out to Utah and be united with Brigham Young and the other apostles. And so I would say that, Ross and Fred were both brilliant theologians, and through their doctrines, I see a bright future if they were put into full practice according to, the best practice according to what the early brethren taught. And, I hope to eventually see the day that there is kind of more organization and that there is better union. It brings to mind a quote by Jedediah M. Grant in the Journal of Discourses that's kind of commenting on the family order that was going on the Trek West. And then they kind of, reverted back to Gentile order, wards and stakes in Utah. And he kind of said that it was actually a good thing that they stayed united. And, I do see significance to what he said. He said, if God's priest is on the earth and you are controlled thereby and listen to its counsel, you will be united as one people. I know the time was that many of this people believed that if a man was adopted here and there, one man would hold this way and another that. But the fact is, in the kingdom and church of the Lord, they are all in one pile. I do not care how many of you have been adopted here or there. That is the doctrine to me. My prayer is that the saints may understand that they are safe as long as they listen to the priesthood authorized of heaven and are united in one and not divided into clans, but become one great clan under one head. Then let all the clanism of the world rally against us, and we are as firm as the rock of ages that supports the throne of Jehovah. And obviously some people can misuse different aspects of that, being controlled by the priesthood. I think all of that is in a context, but what he was really emphasizing and what Brigham Young really emphasized was the need for the saints to be united to accomplish the work of the Lord. And that does need to be, I don't think union for union's sake isn't, if there are false principles involved, that's not good. It needs to be on correct principles, on a solid foundation of morality and truth. And, I hope to see that to LeBaronism come forward in that way, because I do think it has a ton of promise. And I hope to see that promise eventually come to fruition.
But do you think it does?
Oh, I hope it will. I mean, none of us can really read the future. I think that, I hope we can learn from our past mistakes. I think part of the problem is a lot of people will look at the past and they want to cover up the mistakes and not really talk about them, and I think that if you do that, I see the mindset of it. You don't want to focus too much on the negative. You want to be more positive and constructive than looking for things to be critical and negative about. But I do think that you need to understand the problems in the history to be able to recognize those problems and to correct course and to do better, if that makes sense. So I do hope to see LeBaronism come to full fruition based off of the foundational teachings that I think are legitimate and I think that are, perpetuating what Joseph Smith and Brigham Young envisioned the saints to eventually be adopting. So
fantastic. Dude, as always, that was awesome. Let's do it again on another subject sometime.
Dude, thanks for having me. I
Man.
appreciate you taking the time to, out of your vacation to do this second conversation. So,
Dude, it's what I do. So awesome. You're the man, sir. We'll talk to you later.
all right. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.